The cat who refused to leave his dead owner until he heard these 3 words. The first snow of November dusted Alder Creek like powdered sugar, transforming the small New England town into a scene from a vintage postcard. Bracken didn't move. Not when they locked the house, not when they removed the last carpet from the hallway, not even when the cold began to seep through his dense tabby fur. The cat remained rigid as a sentinel on the porch, his amber eyes fixed on Alder Creek's main street, a picturesque lane with a white church at its center, Saturday market stalls, and the morning aroma of cornbread wafting from Maggie's bakery. For 23 days now, Bracken had maintained his vigil. The townspeople walked past, their breath clouding in the increasingly frigid air, some pausing to study the cat with curiosity or concern, others hurrying by with their collars turned up against the wind. But none of them understood what Bracken was waiting for, a familiar shuffling step, the scent of pipe tobacco and mint tea, the soft, gravelly voice that had greeted him every morning for 8 years. "That cat's still there," Martha Lawson remarked to her husband as they passed on their way to the Sunday service. "Poor thing doesn't understand." But Bracken understood more than they knew. He understood that Gerald McAllister, the old man who had rescued him from behind the dumpster at Pinewood Apartments all those years ago, would never return. He'd seen the strangers in dark coats come and go. He'd watched from the window as they'd lowered a wooden box into the ground behind the white church. He'd smelled the absence in the house, felt it in the stillness of the rooms where once there had been movement and life. What Bracken didn't understand was what came next. His 3 defining traits were evident to anyone who took the time to observe him. Loyalty that brought him back to the same porch step day after day, sensitivity that kept him alert to people's moods and intentions, and a quiet courage that emerged whenever everything seemed to push him away. The conflict consuming him was both simple and profound: remain tethered to the past of the empty house or risk an unknown beginning elsewhere. During the first week, he'd rejected any attempt at approach. When 10-year-old Emma Thorne had extended her hand, Bracken had lashed out with a quick swipe, scratching her palm before retreating to the far corner of the porch. Her father, Drew Thorne, who managed the town's hardware store, had immediately declared the cat a safety hazard and began pressuring the municipal shelter to remove him. "That animal is dangerous," Drew insisted at the town council meeting that Thursday. "What if it had been a toddler instead of Emma? What if the scratch gets infected? We can't have a feral cat attacking people right on Main Street." Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Word spread quickly through Alder Creek, a town where news traveled faster than the seasonal wind. Some residents sided with Drew, arguing that a stray cat with aggressive tendencies had no place in their community. Others defended Bracken, pointing out that he'd never caused trouble during Gerald's lifetime and deserved compassion after losing his owner. The porch became a borderline, a space between belonging and abandonment. Each morning at 8, the church bell tolled, and Bracken would merely twitch his nose, catching the scent of warm butter and cinnamon drifting from the bakery. The late autumn wind whistled through the cracks in the porch boards, carrying splinters of wood in its scent. At the market, between sliced apples and jars of preserves, townspeople debated the cat's future. Pastor Williams even mentioned the guardian of the step in his Sunday sermon, speaking of perseverance and memory. The result was immediate. Half the town began to view Bracken as a symbol, while the other half saw him as an obstacle to order. Maeve Donovan, a volunteer at the animal shelter, made the decision not to force Bracken's removal. Instead, she brought food, warm water on cold days, and sat silently about 6 feet away reading a book. Her motivation had discrete roots. She lived alone, dealt with absences that couldn't be hurried away, and saw in the cat a possible reflection of herself. Harlan Winters, who lived on the corner, a widower of few words and heavy steps, observed from his window. He grumbled that street animals caused nothing but trouble, but as twilight fell, he would leave a saucer of milk behind the hawthorn bush. For him, caring without acknowledging it was the safest way to avoid getting hurt. As darkness settled over Alder Creek that evening, Bracken huddled against the cold, his eyes still fixed on the empty street. A light snow began to fall, each flake catching the amber glow of the street lamps before dissolving on the wooden boards. The cat's ears twitched at distant sounds, the closing of a door, laughter from the diner 2 blocks away, the soft rumble of a car passing through. What would it take, the town wondered, to make this stubborn creature understand that life had changed? What would it take for Bracken to move on? No one imagined that 3 words, spoken at just the right moment, would open a door that neither lock nor time had managed to unlock. As the first day of December approached, with its promise of deeper cold and longer nights, Bracken continued his silent watch. What was he waiting for? A miracle? A sign? Or perhaps just the courage to let go? The townspeople of Alder Creek would soon discover that some journeys begin not with a step forward, but with the willingness to stay still long enough for trust to find its way home. The first Tuesday of December brought a crystalline morning to Alder Creek, the kind where breath hung in the air like small clouds and footsteps crunched on frost-stiffened grass. At Maggie's bakery, the morning crowd gathered around the wood stove, cupping steaming mugs of coffee between mittened hands, their conversation inevitably turning to Bracken. "That animal's been there for almost a month now," said Walter Jenkins, adjusting his plaid scarf. "Ain't natural. Cats are supposed to move on, find new territory." "It's loyalty," countered Eleanor Bishop, the retired librarian whose silver hair was always pinned in a neat bun. "Gerald McAllister was good to that cat. Animals remember kindness." "Loyalty or not," Drew Thorne interjected, "it can't stay there forever. Emma's hand is still healing, and the doctor said cat scratches can cause serious infections. What if someone else gets hurt?" The bell above the bakery door jingled as Maeve Donovan entered, snowflakes melting in her auburn hair. Conversation momentarily halted as she unwound her scarf, revealing the shelter logo embroidered on her sweater. At 42, Maeve carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, even from those who disagreed with her approach to the Bracken situation. "Good morning," she said, ordering her usual chamomile tea. She felt the weight of unspoken words in the sudden silence. "Maeve," Drew acknowledged with a nod. "Any progress with that cat? The property agent called me yesterday. They can't show the house properly with a feral animal staking claim to the porch." Maeve added a touch of honey to her tea before responding. "He's not feral, Drew. He's grieving. There's a difference." "Cats don't grieve," Walter scoffed. "They adapt. That's how they survive." "I disagree," Eleanor said gently. "When my Humphrey passed, our Siamese wouldn't eat for days. Just sat by his empty chair waiting." The conversations split along familiar lines. Those who saw Bracken as a nuisance to be removed, and those who believed he deserved patience and understanding. Maeve sipped her tea, listening more than speaking. She learned long ago that in Alder Creek, opinions hardened like cement once people took sides. Outside, the morning light strengthened, casting long shadows across Main Street. Bracken remained in his usual spot, his tabby fur fluffed against the cold amber eyes alert to every movement. When the mail carrier approached, he retreated to the far corner of the porch, muscles tense beneath his coat. Across the street, Harlan Winters watched from behind his curtain. At 73, with arthritic hands and a perpetual scowl, Harlan had cultivated a reputation for keeping to himself. Since losing his wife, Edith, 5 years ago, he'd streamlined his interactions with the town to the bare minimum: grocery shopping on Tuesdays, haircuts on the first Thursday of the month, and Sunday services where he sat in the last pew and left before the final hymn. Yet something about the stubborn cat had caught his attention. Perhaps it was the recognition of a familiar stubbornness, or the way Bracken's vigilance mirrored his own retreat into solitude after Edith's passing. "Fool animal," Harlan muttered, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Later that afternoon, the town council gathered for their weekly meeting. The agenda included road maintenance, the upcoming Christmas festival, and, added at Drew Thorne's insistence, the stray cat situation. Mayor Patricia Caldwell, whose efficiency was matched only by her diplomacy, called the meeting to order. "Before we address the more contentious items on our agenda, let's review the festival preparations." For 40 minutes, they discussed logistics for the annual Christmas celebration, the tree lighting ceremony, the children's choir performance, the artisan market in the town square. Then, inevitably, they reached the final item. "Drew, you've asked to address the council regarding the cat on Gerald McAllister's property," Mayor Caldwell said, adjusting her glasses. Drew stood, straightening his tie. "Thank you, Mayor. As many of you know, there's been a stray cat living on the McAllister porch since Gerald's passing. While I understand the sentiment some folks have about allowing it to stay, I believe it presents several problems for our community." He listed his concerns methodically: the risk of injury to passers-by, especially children, the deterrent to potential homebuyers, the precedent it might set for other strays, the possibility of disease. "I move that we authorize the animal shelter to remove the cat as soon as possible," he concluded. Second, Walter Jenkins said promptly. Mayor Caldwell looked around the room. The motion has been made and seconded. Is there any discussion before we vote? Maeve Donovan rose from her seat in the audience. If I may, Mayor Caldwell? Of course, Maeve. As our shelter representative, your input is valuable. Thank you. Maeve took a deep breath. I understand the concerns about safety, but I want to clarify some misconceptions. First, Bracken, the cat, isn't a stray. He was Gerald McAllister's companion for years, properly vaccinated and cared for. Second, his reaction to Emma was fear-based, not aggression. He's frightened and disoriented, which is natural after losing his person. She paused, gathering her thoughts. The shelter's approach in these situations is to build trust gradually. Forced removal often leads to trauma for the animal and can result in euthanasia if they're deemed unadoptable due to stress behaviors. I'm asking for time, just a few more weeks, to help Bracken adjust and build trust. If we can do that, we can find him a suitable home. Pastor Williams raised his hand. If I might add something? In times of loss, our community has always shown compassion. Gerald was a valued member of our congregation for over 30 years. How we treat what he left behind, even if it's just a cat, reflects on us as a community. The room buzzed with murmured opinions. Drew frowned, clearly impatient with what he saw as unnecessary sentimentality. With respect, he said, we can't make policy decisions based on emotions. There are practical considerations here. All good governance balances practical considerations with compassion, Mr. Thorne, Mayor Caldwell observed. Let's put it to a vote. All in favor of authorizing immediate removal of the cat from the McAllister property. Hands raised. Drew, Walter, and 2 others. All opposed. More hands. Pastor Williams, Councilwoman Morgan, and 3 others. Motion denied, Mayor Caldwell declared. Maeve, the council will revisit this issue in January if the situation remains unchanged. In the meantime, perhaps you could provide regular updates on your progress. Maeve nodded, relief evident in her expression. Of course. Thank you. As the meeting adjourned, Drew approached Maeve, his expression taut with frustration. This isn't over. That cat is dangerous, and I won't have my daughter or anyone else's child at risk because of misplaced sentimentality. I understand your concern for Emma, Maeve replied calmly. But forcing Bracken away won't solve the problem. It will just move it somewhere else, possibly making him more fearful and reactive. Give me a chance to help him. Drew didn't respond, merely turning on his heel and striding away. Outside, darkness had fallen early, as it did in December. Street lamps cast pools of yellow light along Main Street, illuminating the gentle snowfall that had begun during the meeting. At the McAllister house, a small form huddled on the porch, nearly invisible against the deepening shadows. Bracken remained at his post, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. But something had changed. Beside the step, just within reach of a cautious paw, sat a shallow dish of water that hadn't been there before, and next to it, a small portion of tuna on a paper plate. From across the street, behind his curtain, Harlan Winters watched. Then, with a grunt that might have been satisfaction or merely acknowledgement, he let the curtain fall back into place and turned away from the window. The town was divided, but in that division, unexpected alliances were beginning to form, and Bracken, unaware of the debates centered on his future, continued his solitary vigil, waiting for something even he couldn't name. What would tomorrow bring? Another council meeting? Another attempt to remove him, or perhaps another small act of kindness from an unexpected source? The snow continued to fall, covering Alder Creek in a blanket of white that muffled sounds and softened edges, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Christmas lights appeared along Main Street in the second week of December, strings of red, green, and gold bulbs that twinkled against the early darkness. Shop windows displayed miniature winter scenes, tiny skaters on mirror ponds, diminutive houses with cotton smoke curling from chimneys, forest animals gathered around minuscule fires. The town transformed itself, as it did every year, into a vision of holiday cheer that drew tourists from neighboring communities. The McAllister house remained dark, its windows vacant eyes looking out on the festive street. The for sale sign in the front yard gathered snow, the realtor's name barely visible beneath the white accumulation. And still, Bracken maintained his position on the porch. Change came in imperceptible increments, like the gradual shifting of shadows. On Wednesday morning, when Maeve approached with her usual offering of food and water, Bracken didn't retreat to the far corner of the porch. Instead, he watched her from his position. muscles tense, but not poised to flee. Maeve, who had learned to read the subtle language of frightened animals, recognized this as the smallest opening. Not trust, but perhaps the beginning of tolerance. "Good morning, Bracken," she said softly, setting down the dishes and taking her customary seat on the steps, a careful distance away. From her bag, she pulled out a dog-eared paperback, Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, and began to read aloud in a gentle, measured voice. The sound of human speech, not directed at him but simply existing in his space without demand or threat, created a backdrop against which Bracken could relax marginally. His ears, which had been flattened against his head, gradually returned to their normal position. Across the street, Harlan Winters emerged from his house wearing a heavy wool coat and carrying a snow shovel. With methodical movements that belied his arthritic joints, he began clearing his walkway, his breath forming clouds in the crisp air. His eyes, sharp despite his 73 years, noted the tableau on the McAllister porch. The woman reading, the cat watching, the distance between them that seemed somehow less insurmountable than before. When Harlan finished his own walkway, he hesitated, leaning on his shovel. Then, with a decisiveness that surprised even himself, he crossed the street and began clearing the path to the McAllister porch. Bracken immediately tensed, rising slightly on his haunches as the unfamiliar figure approached. Maeve paused in her reading, watching curiously as Harlan worked silently, keeping his movements steady and predictable. "Good morning, Mr. Winters," she said when he came within speaking distance. Harlan nodded, not pausing in his task. "Path needs clearing. Realtor's bringing someone by this afternoon. That's very thoughtful of you." He grunted, neither accepting nor rejecting the compliment. "Cat still won't come inside?" "No. I've tried leaving the door open, but he seems determined to stay on the porch." Harlan glanced at Bracken, who was watching them both with wary attention. "Cats are stubborn creatures. My Edith had one that wouldn't come out from under the bed for 3 weeks after we moved." It was the most personal information Maeve had ever heard from Harlan Winters, whose reputation for taciturnity was legendary in Alder Creek. "What changed?" she asked. "Patience," Harlan said simply. Edith would sit on the floor and read her magazines. No fussing, no coaxing, just being there. Eventually, the cat decided we weren't so bad. He finished clearing the path and turned to leave. As an afterthought, he added, "Weather report says snow tonight, heavy." Maeve understood the unspoken concern. "I'll bring an insulated shelter box this afternoon. And extra food." Harlan nodded and trudged back across the street, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Later that day, as promised, a black sedan pulled up in front of the McAllister house. A realtor in a camel-colored coat escorted a young couple up the freshly cleared path. Bracken, disturbed by the intrusion, retreated to the corner of the porch, his tail lashing in agitation. "As you can see," the realtor was saying, "it's a charming craftsman with original details. Needs some updating, of course, but the bones are excellent." The woman, noticing Bracken, paused. "Oh, whose cat is that?" The realtor's smile tightened slightly. "It belonged to the previous owner. The shelter is working on relocating it." "Poor thing," the woman said, extending her hand cautiously. "I wouldn't," her husband warned. "It might not be friendly." Bracken's ears flattened, his body language clearly communicating his discomfort with the strangers invading his territory. The woman, reading his signals, withdrew her hand. "Let's look inside, shall we?" the realtor suggested, unlocking the front door. As they disappeared into the house, Bracken gradually relaxed, his gaze returning to the street where it had been fixed for so many days. The snow began falling in earnest by mid-afternoon, large flakes that descended in a silent, relentless curtain. Maeve arrived with the promised shelter box, a plastic container lined with insulation, with a small doorway cut into one side. She positioned it in the most protected corner of the porch, then placed fresh food and water nearby. "This should keep you warmer tonight," she told Bracken, who watched her movements from a distance. "I'd still rather you came to the shelter, but I understand why you don't want to leave." She sat on the steps again, this time without her book, simply gazing out at the snow-covered street. After a few minutes of silence, she spoke again, her voice soft against the muffled quiet of the falling snow. "I lost someone too, you know. My mother 3 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. It was quick, just 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end. Some days I still expect to hear her voice when I answer the phone." Bracken's eyes remained fixed on her, his tail curled tightly around his body. "The thing about grief," Maeve continued, "is that it doesn't really go away. You just learn to make space for it, to carry it with you while you keep living." She smiled sadly. I guess that's what we're both figuring out, huh? As if in response, Bracken blinked slowly, a gesture that cat lovers recognize as a sign of trust or affection. It wasn't much, a momentary lowering of defenses, but in the economy of healing, it counted as progress. The snow continued to fall as dusk approached, transforming Alder Creek into a hushed wonderland. Christmas lights winked on, their colors muted through the veil of white. The occasional car crept cautiously along Main Street, tires crunching on the fresh accumulation. From his window, Harlan watched as Maeve finally rose and brushed the snow from her coat. She looked back at Bracken one last time, before making her way carefully down the path and along the sidewalk, her figure gradually disappearing into the swirling white. With a sigh that fogged the glass, Harlan turned away from the window and moved to his kitchen. He opened a can of tuna, draining the oil carefully, then placed a small portion on a saucer. Donning his coat and boots again, he stepped out into the snow and crossed the street, approaching the McAllister porch with measured steps. Bracken watched him come, alert but not panicked. Harlan set the saucer down at the edge of the porch, then backed away several paces. "Not much of a dinner," he said gruffly, "but it's better than nothing." He stood for a moment longer, snow gathering on his shoulders and hat, then turned and walked back to his own house without looking back. If he had turned, he might have seen Bracken edge cautiously toward the saucer, sniffing the offering before taking a tentative bite. He might have witnessed what Maeve would later describe in her journal as the first voluntary connection, a small but significant breach in the wall of isolation Bracken had built around himself. Inside his shelter box, warmed by the extra blanket Maeve had provided, and with a full stomach courtesy of Harlan's tuna, Bracken curled into a tight ball as the snow continued to fall. His vigil hadn't ended. He still waited for something he couldn't articulate, but perhaps, just perhaps, he was beginning to understand that waiting didn't have to mean being alone. What neither Bracken nor his unlikely allies could know was that the heaviest test of their fragile connection was still to come, in the form of a winter storm that would force choices none of them were fully prepared to make. As night deepened over Alder Creek, the snow fell heavier, and the wind began to rise, carrying with it the promise of change. Whether welcome or not remained to be seen. The blizzard arrived with a vengeance that took even the oldest residents of Alder Creek by surprise. It began innocuously enough, the gentle snowfall of Thursday evening gradually intensifying through the night, accompanied by a wind that grew from whisper to howl by dawn. By Friday morning, the town was unrecognizable, transformed into a landscape of white dunes and treacherous ice. Mayor Caldwell declared a state of emergency before 9 o'clock, advising residents to stay indoors and conserve power. The town's single snowplow struggled against the accumulation, focusing on keeping the route to the regional hospital passable. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, and Alder Creek hunkered down to wait out nature's fury. In her small apartment above the bookstore, Maeve woke to a world muffled in white. Her first thought, even before coffee, was of Bracken. The shelter box she'd provided was insulated, but it wasn't designed for blizzard conditions. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and the wind chill factor made it dangerous for any creature to remain exposed. She dressed quickly in layers, thermal underwear, wool sweater, lined jeans, her heaviest socks. Over it all, she pulled on a parka rated for Arctic conditions, a gift from her father when she'd joined a conservation project in Alaska 5 years earlier. Thick boots, a scarf wrapped twice around her face, insulated gloves. She resembled an explorer, preparing for an expedition rather than a woman venturing 6 blocks from her home. The journey, normally a 10-minute walk, took almost 45 minutes through snow that reached mid-thigh in places. The wind cut through her layers despite their thickness, and visibility was limited to a few yards ahead. By the time she reached Main Street, Maeve was questioning her own judgment in venturing out. The McAllister house loomed like a ghost through the swirling snow, its dark windows emphasizing its emptiness. Maeve trudged up the path which had completely disappeared under the new accumulation. The porch, normally Bracken's domain, appeared deserted. "Bracken!" she called, her voice whipped away by the wind almost before the word formed. "Bracken!" No response. The shelter box she'd left was half buried in a drift, its entrance blocked by snow. Panic surged through her as she cleared the opening with gloved hands. Empty. Maeve's heart sank. Where could he have gone? In these conditions, a domestic cat, even one as resilient as Bracken, wouldn't survive long. She scanned the yard, the street, calling his name repeatedly despite knowing the futility of it. The storm swallowed her voice, the wind pressing against her as if intent on driving her back. Across the street, Harlan Winters stood at his window, watching the solitary figure on the McAllister porch. Even through the curtain of snow, he recognized Maeve's distinctive red parka. He saw her frantic movements, understood immediately what, or rather who, she was searching for. With a muttered oath that had less to do with annoyance than concern, Harlan pulled on his own winter gear. His arthritic hands protested as he laced his boots, but he ignored the pain. Outside, the wind nearly knocked him off his feet as he made his way carefully across the street. "He's not there!" Harlan shouted over the howl of the storm as he reached Maeve. She shook her head, eyes wide with worry above her scarf. "The shelter box is empty. He could be anywhere." Harlan gestured toward his house. "Come inside, you'll freeze out here." Maeve hesitated, glancing around once more, as if Bracken might materialize from the whiteout. "We can't help him if we get frostbite," Harlan reasoned. "Come on, I've got coffee." The offer of warmth and caffeine overcame her reluctance. Together, they struggled across the street to Harlan's house, leaning into the wind that seemed determined to push them back. Inside, the contrast was startling. Warmth, stillness, the absence of the wind's constant roar. Harlan's home was exactly as Maeve might have imagined it. Neat, spare, functional. A leather recliner faced a television set that looked at least 20 years old. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with history volumes and what appeared to be naval fiction. No photographs were visible, no mementos or decorative items beyond a ship in a bottle displayed on the mantelpiece. "Take off those wet things," Harlan instructed, moving toward the kitchen. "Hang them by the radiator, I'll get that coffee." Maeve unwound her scarf and unzipped her parka, her fingers clumsy with cold. As she hung them on the coat rack, she noticed something she hadn't been able to see from the doorway. A cat bed positioned near the radiator, and beside it, a small ceramic water dish. Her surprise must have shown on her face when Harlan returned with 2 mugs of coffee, because he immediately looked embarrassed. "Had them from before," he explained gruffly. "My wife's cat. Never got rid of them." Maeve accepted the coffee gratefully, warming her hands around the mug. "Thank you, I didn't mean to intrude on your morning." Harlan waved away her apology. "You weren't thinking straight going out in that." He nodded toward the window, where snow continued to fall in a relentless curtain. "Cats probably found shelter somewhere. They're good at that." "I hope so." Maeve took a sip of coffee, strong and black, jolting her system awake. "I should have brought him to the shelter yesterday when I saw the forecast. I just didn't want to force him. He's been through so much already." Harlan settled into his recliner with a slight grimace as his joints protested. "Sometimes, what we want and what's needed don't line up. Cat might not have wanted to move, but maybe he needed to." The observation hung in the air between them, laden with implications that extended beyond their immediate concern for Bracken. A sudden noise from the kitchen startled them both, a soft thud, followed by what sounded like scratching. Harlan rose with surprising agility for a man his age and moved toward the sound, Maeve close behind. There, at the back door that led to a small enclosed porch, was a snow-covered shape, pawing insistently at the weather stripping. "Well, I'll be damned," Harlan muttered, reaching for the doorknob. The moment the door opened, Bracken darted inside, a streak of wet fur that disappeared beneath the kitchen table. Snow melted from his coat, leaving small puddles on the linoleum. His breathing was rapid, his eyes wide with what might have been fear or simply the shock of transition, from bitter cold to sudden warmth. Maeve dropped to her knees, careful to maintain a distance that wouldn't threaten the frightened cat. "Bracken," she breathed, relief washing through her. "You're okay." Harlan closed the door against the howling wind. I guess he decided the McAllister porch wasn't worth freezing for after all. But how did he know to come here? Maeve wondered aloud. Harlan shrugged, though a slight flush colored his weathered cheeks. Might have been leaving food out back for a while. Not much, just enough to keep him going. Maeve looked up at him, a new understanding dawning. "You've been feeding him." "Since when?" "Couple weeks, maybe." Harlan busied himself with filling a small dish with water, which he set on the floor near, but not too near, Bracken's hiding place. Didn't seem right, him being out there alone. From beneath the table, Bracken watched them warily, his tail wrapped tightly around his body, ears still flattened against his head. But he didn't bolt, didn't hiss or show any signs of aggression, just wariness, the natural caution of a creature who had learned that the world could change without warning. "He needs to warm up slowly," Maeve said, professional concern taking over. "And he's probably dehydrated. Do you have any tuna? The oil is good for getting calories into him quickly." Harlan nodded and moved to a cupboard, retrieving a can. As he prepared a small plate of tuna, Maeve noticed something she hadn't before, a gentle care in his movements, a tenderness at odds with his gruff exterior. They placed the tuna near the water dish and backed away, giving Bracken space. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the cat emerged from beneath the table. His movements were stiff, whether from cold or caution wasn't clear. He approached the food cautiously, sniffed it, and began to eat with single-minded focus. Maeve and Harlan exchanged glances, a moment of shared victory, small but significant. Outside, the storm continued unabated, snow piling against windows and doors, wind finding every crack and crevice in the old houses along Main Street. Inside, an unlikely trio, a solitary widower, a shelter volunteer, and a grieving cat, formed a temporary alliance against the elements. As the day wore on, they established an uneasy coexistence. Bracken, gradually relaxing as warmth seeped back into his bones, claimed the space beneath the radiator as his territory. Harlan moved about his daily routines with minimal adjustments for his unexpected guests. Maeve, trapped by the worsening storm, made several calls to the shelter to ensure other animals were being cared for, then settled onto Harlan's sofa with one of his naval history books. By evening, the power began to flicker. Harlan brought out candles and matches, setting them strategically around the living room. Storm's taking down lines, he observed, glancing out at the still falling snow. Might be a long night. Maeve nodded, watching as Bracken cautiously emerged from his spot beneath the radiator to investigate a patch of candlelight on the floor. It was the most normal behavior she'd seen from him since Gerald's passing, simple feline curiosity, untempered by grief or fear. "He's doing better," she said softly. Harlan grunted an acknowledgement. Amazing what a warm place and a full belly can do. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving them in the gentle glow of candles. The sudden silence, the absence of the refrigerator's hum, the heating system's background noise, made the storm outside seem even louder by contrast. Bracken, startled at the change, retreating back to his safe spot with a quick, fluid movement. But after a moment, his head reappeared, eyes reflecting the candlelight as he assessed this new development. "Power company says it could be out till morning," Harlan reported after checking his battery-powered radio. "Temperature's going to drop in here without the furnace. I can head back to my place if the storm lets up," Maeve offered, though the prospect of venturing out again into the blizzard was daunting. Harlan shook his head. "No sense in that. No sense in that. Got a spare room, sheets are clean." Harlan's tone made it clear this wasn't a matter for debate. "Been meaning to test that wood stove anyway. Haven't used it since Edith." He trailed off, suddenly busy with arranging kindling in the small cast-iron stove that sat in one corner of the living room. Maeve noticed how his hands moved with practiced efficiency despite their arthritic stiffness, a muscle memory from years of similar tasks. "Thank you," she said simply. "I appreciate it." As the evening deepened into night, the wood stove radiated a gentle heat that kept the worst of the cold at bay. They shared a simple meal of soup, warmed on the stovetop, and crackers that Harlan produced from a seemingly bottomless pantry. "Always keep supplies," he explained. "Learned that in the Navy. Never know when you might get cut off." It was the first personal detail he'd volunteered, and Maeve recognized it as the small opening it was. "How long did you serve?" 27 years. Retired as Chief Petty Officer. There was a quiet pride in his voice. "Met Edith while on shore leave in Boston. Married her 6 months later. Best decision I ever made." Bracken, perhaps drawn by the warmth or the steady cadence of human voices, had ventured closer to the stove. He still maintained a careful distance from both humans, but his body language had relaxed considerably. Tail loosely curled rather than tucked tight, ears forward instead of flattened. "Look at that," Maeve murmured. "He's curious." Harlan observed the cat with thoughtful eyes. "Reminds me of Edith's cat after we moved here. Suspicious of everything for weeks. Used to check every room like he expected traps." What changed? Time. Routine. Seeing the same faces, hearing the same voices. Eventually figured out we weren't the enemy. Harlan's weathered face softened slightly in the candlelight. Turned into a regular lap cat once he made up his mind we were acceptable. Maeve smiled, imagining the gruff sailor with a contented cat on his knees. Bracken might never be a lap cat. Some aren't, even with people they trust. But he could still have a good life. "At the shelter, you mean?" She hesitated. "Eventually with an adoptive family, but that's a long way off. He needs to learn to trust again first." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the windows in their frames. Bracken's ears twitched at the sound, but he remained where he was, apparently having decided that whatever lay beyond the walls was more threatening than what was within. As the candles burned lower and the night deepened, conversation between Maeve and Harlan flowed more easily. She learned that he had grown up in a coastal town in Maine, that he had traveled to 37 countries during his naval career, that he and Edith had never had children, just wasn't in the cards for us, but had been happy nonetheless in their quiet life together. In turn, she told him about her work at the shelter, her childhood in Vermont, her brief marriage that had ended amicably when she and her ex-husband realized they wanted different futures. She spoke of her mother's illness and how it had changed her perspective on what mattered. After she was gone, I kept thinking about all the conversations we never had, Maeve admitted, all the questions I never asked. It made me realize how much we leave unsaid, assuming there will always be time later. Harlan nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the wood stove. Edith went quick, heart attack while gardening, found her among her roses. He paused, seeming to search for words. Sometimes I talk to her still, out loud, like she might answer. Neighbors probably think I've lost my marbles. I don't think that's strange at all, Maeve said gently. I think it's how we keep them with us. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional crack of wood in the stove and the persistent howl of the wind. Bracken, who had been gradually edging closer throughout their conversation, now sat barely 2 feet away from Maeve's chair, his amber eyes half closed in the warmth. Slowly, telegraphing her movements to avoid startling him, Maeve extended her hand palm up on the floor between them, not reaching toward him, simply offering connection if he chose to accept it. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then, with deliberate caution, Bracken stretched his neck forward and sniffed her fingertips. His whiskers brushed her skin, a touch so light it was barely perceptible. He didn't move closer, didn't invite stroking, but neither did he retreat. It was a small victory, this moment of voluntary contact. Maeve remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe lest she break the fragile thread of trust that had formed between them. Across the room, Harlan watched without comment, but the slight nod he gave conveyed his understanding of the significance. Eventually, Bracken withdrew, returning to his spot near the stove, where he curled into a tight ball, eyes closing in what appeared to be genuine sleep, perhaps the first restful sleep he'd had since Gerald's passing. "Well," Harlan said quietly, "guess that settles the question of where he's spending the night." As if in agreement, the wind gave a particularly fierce howl, driving snow against the windows with a sound like sand on glass. Later, lying beneath quilts in Harlan's spare room, a space that felt preserved rather than unused, with its carefully made bed and single photograph of Edith on the nightstand, Maeve reflected on the strange turns life could take. 24 hours ago, she would never have imagined finding shelter with Alder Creek's most notorious recluse, or witnessing Bracken's first tentative steps toward healing. The storm that had forced them together might prove to be the catalyst they all needed, a disruption of established patterns, a push toward new possibilities. But what would happen when the snow stopped falling, when power was restored and roads were cleared? Would Bracken retreat back into his grief? Would Harlan return to his solitude? Would the tenuous connections formed in the crucible of the blizzard survive the return to normalcy? These questions followed Maeve into sleep, accompanied by the rhythmic sound of wind and the occasional creak of the old house settling around them. Morning brought a transformed world. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched white beneath a sky of startling blue. Sunlight reflected off the snow with diamond brilliance, almost painful to the eye. Maeve woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Harlan moving about in the kitchen. When she emerged, dressed in yesterday's clothes, she found him at the stove, frying eggs in an ancient cast-iron pan. "Power's still out," he reported without turning around, "but the camp stove works fine. Hope you like 'em over easy." "Over easy is perfect," she replied, glancing around. "Where's Bracken?" Harlan gestured with his spatula toward the window seat, where the cat sat watching the snow-covered scene outside, his tail wrapped neatly around his paws. He seemed calmer this morning, more settled in his surroundings. "Been there since dawn," Harlan said, watching the birds at the feeder. Ordinary moments, a shared breakfast, a cat observing birds, coffee sipped while discussing the weather report on Harlan's battery-powered radio. Yet beneath the mundane surface ran currents of change, subtle shifts in the landscape of their separate lives. What neither of them could know, as they cleared snow from Harlan's walkway later that morning, was that the storm had altered more than just their immediate circumstances. It had set in motion events that would ripple through Alder Creek, challenging assumptions, creating new alliances, and ultimately offering all of them, human and feline alike, a chance at the healing they didn't know they needed. As Maeve prepared to make her way back to her apartment, now that the roads were being cleared, she paused at Harlan's door. "What about Bracken?" she asked, the question that had been hovering between them all morning. Harlan glanced at the cat, who had returned to his spot by the radiator. "Reckon he can stay a bit till things settle." It wasn't a permanent solution, they both knew that, but it was a beginning, a bridge between past and future that none of them had anticipated. What would tomorrow bring? The question lingered as Maeve made her way carefully along the plowed sidewalk, the brilliant sun turning the snow-covered town into a glittering wonderland that bore little resemblance to the dark, wind-lashed place it had been just hours before. Change, it seemed, could come as suddenly and completely as a winter storm, transforming the familiar into something new and unexplored. The challenge lay in navigating the altered landscape with open eyes and willing hearts. News travels fast in small towns. By noon, the day after the blizzard, half of Alder Creek knew that Bracken had taken shelter with Harlan Winters during the storm. By evening, embellishments had been added to the tale. Some said Harlan had braved the worst of the blizzard to rescue the cat from certain death. Others claimed Bracken had appeared mysteriously at Harlan's door like a feline ghost. Still others suggested that Maeve Donovan had orchestrated the whole thing as part of a secret plan to rehabilitate the town's most notorious recluse along with its most famous feline. At Maggie's bakery, Eleanor Bishop held court at her usual table, dispensing her version of events to anyone who would listen. Maeve says the cat went right up to Harlan's back door, like he knew exactly where to find help, she told Walter Jenkins and Martha Lawson over cinnamon rolls and coffee. And Harlan, can you believe it? Harlan had been feeding him for weeks without telling a soul. "Well, that doesn't sound like Harlan at all," Martha remarked, adjusting her reading glasses. "Man barely speaks 2 words at church coffee hour, and suddenly he's secretly caring for a stray." "Not a stray," Eleanor corrected. "Gerald McAllister's cat. That makes a difference." Walter snorted. "Cat, stray, pet, whatever you call it, it still caused nothing but trouble since Gerald passed. Ask Drew Thorne about his daughter's hand." "Emma's fine," Martha dismissed. "Besides, the cat was scared. Animals lash out when they're frightened, just like people do." The bell above the bakery door jingled as Drew himself entered, stamping snow from his boots. Conversation immediately hushed, then resumed with deliberate casualness as he approached the counter to place his order. "Morning, Drew," Maggie greeted him. "The usual, please, and a hot chocolate for Emma. She's helping me at the store today since school's still closed." While Maggie prepared his coffee and pastries, Drew couldn't help overhearing Eleanor's continued narration of the Bracken situation. Living in Harlan's house now, apparently. Maeve says he's already showing signs of improvement, less fearful, eating regularly. She thinks with time and patience. Drew cleared his throat as he paid for his order. "Excuse me, but are you talking about that feral cat? The one that attacked my daughter?" Eleanor turned, her expression cooling slightly. "We were discussing Bracken, yes, and as I've said before, he's not feral. He's a traumatized pet who lost his owner." "Well, whatever you want to call him, I'm glad he's off the street," Drew said firmly. "Though I'm surprised the shelter allowed him to go to Harlan Winters instead of taking him in properly." "It's a temporary arrangement." Maeve's voice came from the doorway where she had just entered, catching the tail end of the conversation. "Until Bracken is more comfortable with human interaction. The shelter approved it as a foster situation." The last part wasn't strictly true. Maeve had simply informed her supervisor of the development, and the woman had been too busy dealing with other animals affected by the storm to object, but it sounded more official this way. Drew nodded stiffly. "Well, as long as he's contained and not a threat to public safety, I suppose that's an improvement." The tension in the bakery was palpable as Drew collected his order and left, the bell jingling cheerfully behind him in stark contrast to the mood he left in his wake. Maeve sighed as she stepped up to the counter. "Tea, please, Maggie, and maybe one of those blueberry scones." "Coming right up," Maggie replied with a sympathetic smile. "Don't mind Drew. He's just being protective of Emma." "I understand that. I just wish he could see that Bracken isn't some vicious predator. He's just a cat who's been through trauma." Eleanor beckoned Maeve to join their table once she had her tea. "Tell us everything," she insisted. "How is Bracken doing at Harlan's? And more importantly, how is Harlan dealing with having a house guest, feline or otherwise?" Maeve smiled, despite her lingering frustration. Surprisingly well, actually. When I left yesterday, Bracken was curled up by the radiator, and Harlan was reading the newspaper, like it was the most normal thing in the world to have a cat in his house again. Again? Martha leaned forward, interest piqued. Harlan had a cat before. His wife did, Maeve explained. She still had all the supplies, bed, dishes, everything. This revelation sparked a new round of speculation about Harlan Winters, whose private life had been a subject of curious whispers since his wife's passing 5 years earlier. The fact that he had preserved his late wife's cat's belongings was deemed alternately sweet, sad, or a bit strange, don't you think? Depending on who was commenting. Across town, unaware of his newfound celebrity, Harlan was engaged in an unusual conversation of his own. "Don't get comfortable," he told Bracken, who was indeed looking quite settled on the windowsill, watching snowbirds at the feeder. "This is temporary, understand? Just until the weather improves and they find you a proper home." Bracken blinked slowly, his amber eyes regarding Harlan with what might have been indifference or profound understanding. It was impossible to tell with cats. "I'm not a cat person," Harlan continued, refilling Bracken's water dish despite his protestations. "Edith was the one who liked having animals around. I just tolerated it." This was not entirely true, as evidenced by the careful way Harlan had stored and maintained Edith's cat's belongings after both her and the cat had passed. But admitting attachment to people, places, or creatures had never been Harlan's strong suit. The doorbell rang, an unusual enough occurrence in itself to make both man and cat start slightly. Harlan peered through the peephole, then opened the door with obvious reluctance. "Pastor Williams," he acknowledged. "What brings you out in this weather?" The pastor, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, smiled warmly. "Checking on my flock after the storm, Harlan. May I come in for a moment?" Harlan stepped back, allowing the pastor to enter. "Power's still out, so I can't offer coffee." "No need, I've had plenty already today." Pastor Williams removed his hat and gloves, then noticed Bracken, who had retreated to his spot beneath the radiator at the arrival of a stranger. "Ah, so the rumors are true. You've taken in our local celebrity." Harlan grunted non-committally. "Temporary situation." "Of course." The pastor settled onto the sofa without waiting for an invitation, clearly comfortable in his role as visitor to the parish homes. "Still, it's a kindness you've shown, more than many would have done." "Wasn't looking for praise," Harlan said gruffly, remaining standing rather than joining his visitor on the sofa. "I know that, Harlan." "It's not in your nature to seek attention." Pastor Williams regarded him thoughtfully, "which is why I found it especially meaningful that you opened your home this way." Something in the pastor's tone made Harlan uncomfortable, an implied significance beyond the simple act of sheltering a cat during a storm. He changed the subject abruptly. "Roads getting cleared?" "Slowly. The main street is passable now and they're working on the side roads. Should have power back by tomorrow, they're saying." Pastor Williams glanced again at Bracken, who was watching them both with wary attention. Maeve Donovan mentioned that Gerald's cat has been through quite an ordeal, refusing to leave the porch, even in the worst weather. "Loyalty," Harlan said, the word escaping before he could consider it. "Or stubbornness. Sometimes hard to tell the difference." Pastor Williams smiled. "Indeed. Both admirable qualities in their way, though they can sometimes keep us stuck when we need to move forward." He rose, reaching for his hat and gloves. "Well, I won't take up any more of your time. Just wanted to make sure you were managing all right after the storm." At the door he paused. "The church is organizing a community dinner next Sunday to celebrate making it through the blizzard. Nothing formal, just a potluck. It would be nice to see you there, Harlan. You'd be welcome to bring your temporary house guest in spirit, so to speak." After the pastor left, Harlan stood at the window, watching him make his way carefully along the cleared path to the street. The invitation hung in the air, unwelcome yet persistent, like the memory of Edith's voice calling him to dinner when he'd rather stay in his workshop. "Don't get any ideas," he told Bracken, who had emerged from his hiding place and was now sitting near Harlan's feet, though still maintaining a careful distance. "I don't do community dinners." The cat yawned, revealing pink tongue and sharp teeth, seemingly unimpressed by Harlan's declaration. Later that afternoon, as the early winter darkness began to fall, Maeve arrived with a bag of supplies: cat food, a new toy, a soft brush. "Thought these might help," she explained as Harlan let her in. "How's he doing?" "Fine," Harlan replied, accepting the bag with awkward gratitude. "Eating, sleeping, cat things." Maeve smiled at his terseness. "Has he let you touch him yet?" "Haven't tried. Figure he'll decide when he's ready." This approach, giving Bracken space to set his own pace, aligned perfectly with Maeve's philosophy on working with traumatized animals. She felt a surge of appreciation for Harlan's intuitive understanding. "That's exactly right," she affirmed. "Building trust takes time, especially after what he's been through." Bracken had emerged at the sound of Maeve's voice, approaching with the same cautious curiosity he'd shown the previous day. He sniffed at the bag she'd brought, whiskers twitching with interest at the new scents. "Hello, handsome," Maeve greeted him softly. "Remember me?" Slowly telegraphing her movements as she had before, she extended her hand palm up on the floor. This time Bracken approached more readily, sniffing her fingers with less hesitation. Then, to both her and Harlan's surprise, he briefly touched his forehead against her knuckles, a fleeting gesture of acceptance or perhaps gratitude. "Well, look at that," Maeve breathed, careful not to make any sudden movements that might startle him. "He's definitely making progress." Harlan watched this interaction with an expression that might have been approval. Pastor Williams stopped by earlier, mentioned a community dinner on Sunday. The abrupt change of subject caught Maeve off guard. "Oh, the one at the church? I heard about that. Are you thinking of going?" Harlan shrugged, busying himself with unpacking the supplies she'd brought. "Not really my thing." "It might be nice," Maeve suggested carefully. "After being cooped up during the storm, some company could be good." "Got company right here." Harlan nodded toward Bracken, who had retreated to investigate the new toy, a small fabric mouse stuffed with catnip. Maeve recognized the deflection for what it was and didn't press the issue. Instead, she updated him on the town's recovery efforts. Power being restored to the east side, the supermarket reopening with limited supplies, the community center being used as a warming station for those still without heat. As she prepared to leave, she hesitated at the door. "I was thinking, if you don't mind, I could stop by again tomorrow, just to check on Bracken's progress." Harlan nodded, his expression unreadable. Doors open. It was as close to an invitation as Harlan Winters had issued to anyone in years, and they both knew it. The implications of this small opening hung between them as Maeve made her way back down the cleared path to the street. Behind her, framed in the doorway, stood the unlikely pair, the reclusive widower and the grieving cat, both watching her departure with expressions that mirrored each other more than either would have admitted, a mixture of wariness, curiosity, and the faintest glimmer of hope. What none of them could have anticipated was how quickly their private arrangement would become public knowledge, or how the simple act of sheltering a cat during a storm would catalyze changes throughout Alder Creek, changes that would challenge long-held assumptions and open doors long thought permanently closed. As darkness settled over the snow-covered town, lights began to flicker on as power was gradually restored. In homes across Alder Creek, conversations turned to the unusual developments on Main Street, the tale of the stubborn cat, the reclusive widower, and the shelter worker, who had somehow brought them together. By morning, the story would have grown new details, some true, some embellished, all part of the fabric of small-town life where personal narratives become collective property, shared and shaped by the community that holds them. What would Drew Thorne make of these developments? How would the town council view this unofficial resolution to the Bracken situation? And most importantly, what would happen when Bracken eventually had to leave Harlan's temporary sanctuary? These questions hung in the air like the last snowflakes of the storm, suspended in time, waiting to settle into a new pattern that none of them could yet discern. The community dinner at Alder Creek's First Congregational Church was traditionally held in the basement hall, a space that smelled perpetually of coffee and lemon-scented floor polish. On this particular Sunday evening, the hall was transformed by twinkling lights strung from the ceiling beams, tables covered with mismatched but cheerful cloths, and the aromas of dozens of home-cooked dishes brought by parishioners and townspeople. Maeve arrived early to help set up, carrying a casserole of baked macaroni and cheese, her mother's recipe, comfort food perfect for a post-blizzard gathering. She greeted Eleanor Bishop and Martha Lawson, who were arranging silverware in neat rows beside stacks of plates. "Any word on whether Harlan's coming?" Eleanor asked without preamble, her eyes bright with curiosity. Maeve shook her head. "I haven't spoken to him since Friday, but I wouldn't count on it. He was pretty clear that community gatherings aren't his thing." "Such a shame," Martha commented, straightening a slightly crooked fork. "After Edith passed, we all tried to include him, but he just withdrew. Hardly see him except at the grocery store or getting his mail." "People grieve differently," Maeve said, feeling oddly protective of Harlan's privacy. "Some need space. 5 years is a lot of space," Eleanor pointed out. But you might be right. And now he has company, even if it's just a cat. Speaking of which, how is our celebrity feline doing? Before Maeve could answer, the door to the hall opened, admitting a blast of cold air, and, to everyone's surprise, Harlan Winters himself. He stood awkwardly in the entrance, clutching a covered dish, his expression suggesting he was already regretting his decision to attend. Conversation stuttered, then halted entirely, as people noticed his arrival. For many, it was the first time they'd seen Harlan at a social event since Edith's funeral. Pastor Williams moved forward immediately, extending a hand in welcome. "Harlan, so glad you could join us. Please come in out of the cold." Harlan nodded stiffly, handing over his offering, what appeared to be a homemade apple crisp, to Martha, who received it with barely concealed astonishment. "Edith's recipe," he muttered by way of explanation. "Thought it might fit the occasion." "How thoughtful," Martha managed, recovering her composure. "I'll put it with the other desserts." Maeve caught Harlan's eye across the room and smiled encouragingly. He acknowledged her with a slight nod before allowing Pastor Williams to guide him toward the beverage table. The momentary pause in activity dissolved as people returned to their preparations, though now with an undercurrent of whispered comments about Harlan's unexpected appearance. Maeve overheard fragments as she arranged serving spoons beside the hot dishes. First time since the funeral. Must be because of that cat. Edith would be pleased to see him here. Drew Thorne arrived with his wife and daughter as the gathering was hitting its stride. Emma, her hand now healed but still bearing a faint pink line where bracken had scratched her, gazed around the festive hall with the eager enthusiasm of a 10-year-old anticipating dessert. Her eyes widened when she spotted Harlan standing somewhat awkwardly by the punch bowl. "Dad, isn't that the man who's taking care of the cat now? The one from the porch?" she asked, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Drew's expression tightened slightly. "Yes, Emma. Mr. Winters is temporarily fostering the animal until the shelter can find a permanent solution. Can I ask him about it? I want to know if the cat's okay." Before Drew could object, Emma had slipped away from his side and approached Harlan, who looked distinctly uncomfortable at being directly addressed by a child. "Excuse me, Mr. Winters. I'm Emma. I'm the girl the cat scratched." Harlan cleared his throat, glancing around as if seeking escape. Yes. Sorry about that. It's okay. I scared him. I shouldn't have reached out so fast." Emma studied Harlan with the direct curiosity of childhood. "Is he still scared? The cat, I mean." "Less than before," Harlan answered, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Still keeps his distance mostly. My grandma had a scared cat once. It lived under her bed for a whole month. Then one day it just decided we were okay and came out." Emma smiled brightly. "Maybe your cat will do that too." "He's not my cat," Harlan corrected automatically. "Just staying temporarily." "Oh," Emma considered this. "But you're taking care of him, right? So he's kind of yours for now." This childish logic seemed to stump Harlan momentarily. Before he could formulate a response, Drew appeared at his daughter's side. "Emma, let's not bother Mr. Winters." He nodded stiffly to Harlan. "Sorry about that." "No bother," Harlan replied, surprising himself as much as Drew. "She's just curious about the cat." Drew's expression wavered between his usual disapproval of the Bracken situation and a father's pride in his daughter's compassion. Before the moment could become awkward, Pastor Williams announced that the buffet was open, and people began to form a line, effectively breaking the tableau. Maeve, who had witnessed the exchange from across the room, found herself unexpectedly moved by the simple interaction. Harlan, who by all accounts had barely spoken to anyone in years, engaged in conversation with the very child who had been scratched by bracken. It was a small moment, insignificant perhaps in the grand scheme of things, but it felt like a tiny crack in a dam that had held for too long. As the evening progressed, Harlan remained on the periphery of the gathering, occasionally exchanging brief words with those who approached him, but mostly observing the community he had withdrawn from years ago. Maeve noticed that he seemed most comfortable talking with the older residents, those who had known Edith, who remembered him from before his self-imposed isolation. "Your apple crisp is delicious," she told him when she finally found a moment to approach. "Edith's recipe, you said?" Harlan nodded. "She made it every fall when the Macs came in. Said store-bought apples wouldn't do it justice." "She was right," Maeve smiled. "How's Bracken doing? Still settling in?" "Well enough. Found him sleeping on Edith's reading chair this morning." There was a complicated emotion in Harlan's voice. Not quite displeasure, perhaps closer to bemused acceptance. "That's progress," Maeve observed. "He's feeling secure enough to claim territory." Next thing you know, he'll be demanding the good china." The dry humor caught Maeve by surprise, and she laughed, a genuine sound that drew glances from nearby tables. Harlan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes lightened fractionally. Across the room, Drew watched this interaction with a furrowed brow. His wife, Caroline, followed his gaze. "What's troubling you now?" she asked quietly. "I don't understand why everyone's so invested in this situation," Drew replied. "It's a stray cat, not a community project." Caroline sighed. "It's not just about the cat, Drew. It's about Gerald and Harlan and, I don't know, maybe about how we take care of each other when things are difficult. The cat scratched our daughter," Drew reminded her, though with less heat than before. "And Emma's forgiven it," Caroline pointed out. "Maybe you should too." Before Drew could respond, Emma returned to their table, plate laden with desserts. "Dad, Mrs. Bishop says Mr. Winters might bring the cat to the shelter tomorrow for a checkup. Can we go see him?" "Please?" Drew looked at his daughter's eager face, then at his wife's pointed expression. "We'll see, Emma. Depends on my schedule at the store." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the immediate no he would have given a week ago. Something was shifting, not just in Harlan or Bracken, but in the community's response to them both. As the evening wound down, Pastor Williams took a moment to address the gathered townspeople. "Before we all head home, I want to thank everyone who made this dinner possible. After the storm, it's especially meaningful to come together like this." He smiled warmly. "I'm reminded of something my grandmother used to say. Storms may knock down fences, but they also show us who will help rebuild them." This past week, I've seen countless examples of neighbors helping neighbors, clearing driveways, sharing generators, checking on the elderly. That's what makes Alder Creek special. There was a murmur of agreement throughout the hall. "And sometimes," the pastor continued, "help comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes it's a volunteer who braves a blizzard to check on a cat." He nodded toward Maeve. "Sometimes it's a neighbor who opens his door when it matters most." His gaze shifted to Harlan, who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the attention. "And sometimes it's a stubborn feline who reminds us all that grief and healing are not straightforward journeys." The pastor's words hung in the air, resonating differently with each person who heard them. For Maeve, they affirmed her belief in the importance of patience and compassion. For Harlan, they uncomfortably highlighted his reluctant re-entry into community life. For Drew, they challenged his binary view of the Bracken situation as either a problem to solve or a nuisance to eliminate. As people began gathering coats and dishes, preparing to venture back into the cold winter night, Maeve approached Harlan once more. "Do you need help getting Bracken to the shelter tomorrow? I could bring a carrier." Harlan shook his head. "Got it handled. Found Edith's old carrier in the attic. Needs dusting, but it'll do." "Okay. I'll be there around 10 if that works for you." He nodded, then hesitated before adding, "He sat on my lap last night, just for a minute, then got spooked by something outside and took off." The significance of this development wasn't lost on Maeve. "That's huge progress, Harlan. He's starting to really trust you." "Maybe." Harlan's expression remained impassive, but there was a note in his voice that hadn't been there before. A hint of what might have been pride, or perhaps the quieter satisfaction of having made a genuine connection, however small. As they parted ways in the church parking lot, Maeve couldn't help reflecting on the strange series of events that had brought them to this point. A storm, a grieving cat, a reclusive widower, and the unexpected alliances forming around them. None of it had been planned. None of it followed the orderly process she might have designed as a shelter volunteer, yet somehow it was working in ways she couldn't have anticipated. Back at his house, Harlan found Bracken waiting by the door, amber eyes gleaming in the dim light of the entryway. "Community dinner," Harlan explained as he hung up his coat. "Lot of fuss about nothing." Bracken blinked slowly, then padded after Harlan into the living room, maintaining the careful distance he still kept most of the time. But as Harlan settled into his recliner with a sigh, the cat circled once, twice, then curled up on the floor beside the chair, not touching, but closer than he'd been before. "Shelter visit tomorrow," Harlan informed him, reaching for his reading glasses and the naval history book he'd been working through. "Checkup, vaccination update, don't make a fuss about it." Bracken's ear twitched, the only acknowledgement of Harlan's words. The silence that settled between them was comfortable in a way that surprised Harlan. After Edith's passing, silence had been his constant companion, heavy, oppressive, a reminder of absence rather than a neutral state. But this silence, shared with another living being, felt different. Not quite like the companionable quiet he'd known with Edith, but not the hollow emptiness of the years since either. Something had changed, and Harlan wasn't entirely certain how he felt about it. The next morning brought clear skies and temperatures that had moderated slightly from the bitter cold of the previous week. Harlan prepared for the shelter visit with the same methodical approach he applied to all tasks, locating the cat carrier in the attic, cleaning it thoroughly, lining it with a soft towel that still faintly smelled of Edith's lavender sachets. The challenge, of course, would be getting Bracken into the carrier. Harlan had enough experience with cats to know that even the most docile feline could transform into a writhing bundle of claws and resistance when faced with confinement. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. We can do this easy or hard, he informed Bracken, who was watching his preparations with evident suspicion. Your choice. When the doorbell rang at precisely 10 o'clock, Harlan was still contemplating his strategy. He opened the door to find not only Maeve, but also unexpectedly Emma Thorne and her father standing on his porch. "Good morning," Maeve greeted him cheerfully. "I hope you don't mind the extra company." Emma was very interested in seeing how Bracken is doing. Harlan's gaze shifted to Drew, whose expression suggested he was present under protest rather than by choice. "Emma was persistent," Drew explained stiffly, "and my wife thought it might be educational." Harlan hesitated only briefly before stepping back to allow them entry. Just getting ready to try the carrier. Might be a two-person job. Emma's eyes widened as she spotted Bracken, who had retreated to his spot beneath the radiator at the sound of unfamiliar voices. "He looks better," she observed, keeping her distance this time. "Not so skinny." "Been eating well," Harlan confirmed. "Still skittish, though." Maeve assessed the situation with a professional eye. Getting him into the carrier might be tricky. He's made progress, but containment is still going to feel threatening. "I have an idea," Emma said suddenly. "My grandma's scared cat liked being wrapped in a blanket. She said it made him feel safe. Maybe we could wrap Bracken in a blanket first, then put him in the carrier." The adults exchanged glances, considering the suggestion. "That's actually a good approach," Maeve acknowledged. "It might work, especially if we use something with a familiar scent." Harlan disappeared briefly into another room, returning with a faded quilt that had seen better days. "Edith's," he explained briefly. "Been on the sofa." He slept on it. Working together, they devised a plan. Maeve would engage Bracken's attention with a small amount of tuna, while Harlan approached from behind with the quilt. Emma and Drew would stay back, observing but not adding to Bracken's stress. The operation proceeded with mixed success. Bracken was indeed distracted by the tuna, but not enough to ignore Harlan's approach entirely. When the quilt descended, he twisted with surprising agility, nearly escaping. But Harlan's reflexes, honed by years of naval service, were quick enough to complete the wrap, enveloping Bracken in a secure but gentle bundle. "Now the carrier," Maeve directed, holding the door open. For a moment, it seemed they had succeeded. Bracken, constrained by the quilt, was lowered carefully into the carrier. But just as Harlan was about to close the door, Bracken found leverage and lunged, one paw breaking free, claws extended. "Watch out!" Drew warned, pulling Emma back instinctively. But the warning came too late. Bracken's claws caught Harlan's hand, drawing 3 parallel lines of red across his weathered skin. Harlan didn't flinch, didn't curse, merely completed the motion, securing the carrier door despite the injury. "Got him," he announced calmly. "You're bleeding," Emma pointed out, her eyes wide. Harlan glanced at his hand, as if noticing the scratches for the first time. Just a scratch. Hazard of the job. Drew's expression was unreadable as he watched Harlan calmly rinse the wound at the kitchen sink and apply an adhesive bandage from a first aid kit Maeve located in a drawer. "I guess he got both of us now," Emma said, holding up her own hand with its fading scratch. "We match." The simple observation, delivered with a child's straightforward acceptance, somehow diffused the tension of the moment. Even Drew's expression softened slightly. "Let's get him to the shelter before he figures out how to pick the lock on that carrier," Maeve suggested, checking her watch. "Doctor, Lawson is expecting us at 10:30. The unlikely quartet made their way to Drew's SUV, which he had offered as transportation since it would accommodate all of them, plus the carrier more comfortably than Maeve's compact car. Harlan sat in the back beside the carrier, occasionally murmuring reassurances to Bracken, who had subsided into tense silence, amber eyes glaring accusingly through the carrier door. At the shelter, they were greeted by Dr. Emily Lawson, Martha's daughter and the town's only veterinarian. She led them to an examination room, her professional demeanor tinged with curiosity about the unusual group accompanying the famous feline. "So, this is Bracken," she said, peering into the carrier. "I've heard quite a bit about you, young man." The examination proceeded with the expected challenges. Bracken, already stressed from the carrier experience, was not an enthusiastic patient, but Dr. Lawson, experienced with difficult cases, managed to complete a thorough checkup, administer necessary vaccinations, and even draw blood for testing. "Physically, he's in remarkably good shape considering what he's been through," she reported when the examination was complete and Bracken was safely back in his carrier. "Slightly underweight still, but no signs of illness or injury beyond some minor abrasions on his paws, probably from being outside during the worst weather." "Will he be okay?" Emma asked anxiously. "Like, in his head? Mom says animals can get sad like people sometimes." Dr. Lawson smiled at the perceptive question. "That's a very good point, Emma. Yes, animals can experience emotional distress, especially after losing someone they were bonded with. But from what Maeve has told me, Bracken is already showing signs of recovery. He's eating, interacting cautiously with people, and establishing new routines. Those are all positive indicators." "So he's not dangerous?" Drew asked, the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout the visit. Dr. Lawson considered her response carefully. "Bracken isn't dangerous in the sense of being aggressive by nature. His reactions, like the scratch Emma received, and the one Mr. Winters got today, are fear responses, not aggression. As his sense of security increases, those reactions should decrease accordingly." She handed Harlan a small paper bag containing flea preventative and a dietary supplement. "Continue what you're doing, Mr. Winters. The stable environment you're providing is exactly what Bracken needs right now." There was a moment of awkward silence as everyone absorbed the implicit assumption in Dr. Lawson's instructions that Harlan would continue fostering Bracken indefinitely. "It's temporary," Harlan said, though with less conviction than when he'd made the same assertion days earlier, "until the shelter finds a permanent place." Dr. Lawson and Maeve exchanged glances that didn't go unnoticed by Drew or Harlan. "Of course," Maeve agreed smoothly, "but there's no rush. The important thing is Bracken's well-being, and right now he's thriving in your care." As they left the shelter, Emma fell into step beside Harlan, her shorter legs working double time to match his stride. "I think Bracken likes living with you," she announced with the certainty of childhood. "Even if he scratched you. Sometimes you hurt people by accident when you're scared, but it doesn't mean you don't like them." Harlan glanced down at the earnest face looking up at him. "That's so?" Emma nodded firmly. "When I was little, I bit my mom when she was cutting my hair because I got scared of the scissors, but I still loved her. I just forgot to use my words instead of my teeth." This child's wisdom, delivered so matter-of-factly, struck Harlan with unexpected force. He thought of the years since Edith's passing, how he had withdrawn from friends, neighbors, the community that had once been such a natural part of their shared life. Had he, like Emma with her teeth and Bracken with his claws, been reacting from fear rather than intention? The question lingered as they drove back to his house, Bracken now quiet in his carrier, perhaps resigned to his fate, or simply exhausted from the stress of the examination. When they arrived, Drew surprised everyone by offering to help carry things inside. "Emma, wait in the car," he instructed. "I'll just be a minute." Once inside, with Bracken released from his carrier and immediately disappearing beneath the sofa, Drew turned to Harlan with an expression of reluctant respect. "I want to thank you," he said stiffly, "for letting Emma come along today. It was educational for her and for me." Harlan nodded, unsure how to respond to this unexpected overture. "I still think the situation with the cat was handled poorly from the beginning," Drew continued, unable to completely abandon his original position. "But I can see that you and Maeve are providing proper care now, and Dr. Lawson's assessment was reassuring." "He's just a cat who lost his person," Harlan said simply. "Needs time to sort himself out." Something in this straightforward assessment seemed to resonate with Drew. He nodded slowly. "Well, if you need anything, supplies, transportation for future vet visits, let me know. The hardware store carries pet supplies too." With that, he turned and left, leaving Harlan and Maeve standing in the living room, both slightly stunned by this olive branch from the man who had been the most vocal opponent of the Bracken situation. "Well," Maeve said after a moment, "that was unexpected. Town's full of surprises lately," Harlan agreed dryly. From beneath the sofa came a soft sound, not quite a meow, more a chirrup of inquiry. Bracken's amber eyes gleamed in the shadows, watching them both. "I think he's asking if the ordeal is over," Maeve smiled. Yes, Bracken. All done with the vet for now. Harlan checked his watch. Almost noon. Could make sandwiches if you want to stay for lunch. The invitation, delivered with characteristic abruptness, nonetheless represented another small step. Not just for Bracken, but for Harlan himself. Maeve recognized it for what it was, and accepted with a warmth that belied the casual nature of the offer. I'd like that. Thank you. As they moved to the kitchen, Bracken emerged cautiously from his hiding place, following at a distance but clearly unwilling to let them out of his sight after the morning's alarming events. His watchful presence, once merely tolerated, now felt like a natural part of the household rhythm, a third consciousness sharing the space, observing, evaluating, gradually adjusting to new realities. What none of them fully appreciated yet was how their individual journeys had begun to intertwine. Harlan's gradual re-emergence from isolation, Maeve's expanding role beyond shelter volunteer to community connector, Bracken's tentative steps toward trust, even Drew's shifting perspective on what constituted danger versus fear. Each small interaction, each moment of connection or insight, was altering the landscape of their separate lives, creating new pathways where before there had been only established routines or defensive barriers. And in the wider circle of Alder Creek, these changes were being observed, discussed, incorporated into the community narrative. The town that had once been divided over the Bracken situation was finding in it a reflection of larger themes: loss and recovery, isolation and connection, fear and the courage to move beyond it. What would come next? The question hovered, unanswered, but full of possibility, as winter settled more deeply over the New England town and its inhabitants continued their tentative dance of healing. January in Alder Creek brought what locals called the real winter, days of steel-gray skies, nights when the temperature plummeted well below zero, and a quality of light that seemed thinner somehow, less substantial than the golden warmth of autumn or the crystal clarity of December. It was a time when the holiday decorations came down, revealing the stark branches of trees and the weathered clapboards of houses no longer softened by festive lights or fresh snow. In this austere landscape, patterns began to establish themselves. Maeve visited Harlan's house every other day, ostensibly to check on Bracken's progress, but increasingly because the unlikely trio had developed a rhythm of interaction that felt natural, even necessary. Harlan, whose days had once been marked by solitary routines, found himself planning around these visits, making sure there was fresh coffee, occasionally baking something simple from Edith's recipe box, rearranging his schedule to be home when Maeve was expected. Bracken, too, developed new habits. He claimed the window seat in the living room as his primary domain, spending hours watching the birds at Harlan's feeder or tracking the movements of neighbors as they went about their winter business. He no longer hid when the doorbell rang, though he maintained a cautious distance from visitors. Most significantly, he had begun to seek out Harlan's company in the evenings, curling up on the sofa while Harlan read in his recliner, the space between them gradually diminishing as days turned into weeks. "He sat on the arm of my chair last night," Harlan reported to Maeve during one of her visits. "Just appeared there like he'd been doing it for years. Stayed for about 10 minutes before moving back to his spot on the sofa." Maeve smiled, recognizing the importance of this development. "He's claiming you. That's a big step in cat language." Harlan grunted non-committally, but Maeve didn't miss the slight softening around his eyes, a tell she had learned to recognize as his version of pleasure or satisfaction. The town of Alder Creek, meanwhile, had moved on to new topics of conversation. The upcoming Valentine's Day dance at the community center, the school board's debate over snow day policies, the perennial question of whether Maggie's Bakery would finally share its cinnamon roll recipe for the church cookbook. The Bracken situation had been largely resolved in the public mind, transformed from controversy to community law, the tale of the faithful cat, the reclusive widower, and the storm that had brought them together. Or so it seemed until the third Tuesday in January, when a sleek black sedan with out-of-state plates parked in front of the McAllister house. Harlan, washing breakfast dishes at his kitchen sink, noticed the vehicle immediately. Anything out of the ordinary on Main Street registered quickly with his naval veteran's eye for detail. He watched as a woman emerged from the car, her stylish wool coat and city boots marking her as a visitor rather than a local. She stood for a moment, studying the McAllister house with an expression Harlan couldn't quite read from his vantage point. Across the street, the woman consulted a piece of paper in her gloved hand, then turned to survey the neighboring properties. Her gaze lingered on Harlan's house, and after a moment's hesitation, she crossed the street and approached his front door. The doorbell rang just as Harlan was drying his hands on a dish towel. "Mr. Winters?" the woman inquired when he opened the door. She appeared to be in her 40s, with dark hair streaked with premature silver and intelligent eyes behind fashionable glasses. "I'm Jennifer McAllister, Gerald's niece." The name registered immediately. Gerald had mentioned his niece occasionally, his only living relative, a professor at a university in Boston, busy with her career but reliable about birthday calls and holiday visits. "Yes," Harlan acknowledged, suddenly aware of his worn flannel shirt and the dish towel still in his hand. "What can I do for you, Ms. McAllister?" "Jennifer, please." She smiled, though there was a tension beneath the polite expression. "I understand you've been taking care of my uncle's cat." "Bracken?" The question, though anticipated from the moment he'd recognized her name, still landed with unexpected impact. Of course, Gerald's niece would eventually come looking for her uncle's cat. Of course, this arrangement, this temporary solution that had somehow stretched into weeks, would eventually face a reckoning. "That's right," Harlan confirmed. "Found shelter here during the blizzard last month. Been here since." Jennifer's smile warmed slightly. "May I come in? I'd like to see him, if possible." Harlan stepped back, allowing her entry into the front hall. Bracken, who had been in his usual window seat, was nowhere to be seen, likely retreated to one of his hiding spots at the sound of an unfamiliar voice. "He's around somewhere," Harlan said, leading her into the living room. "Doesn't take to strangers right away." Jennifer nodded, removing her gloves but keeping her coat on, suggesting she didn't intend to stay long. "That sounds like Bracken. Uncle Gerald always said he was discerning about people." She glanced around the room, taking in the naval memorabilia, the bookshelves, the general tidiness that spoke of Harlan's disciplined nature. "I want to thank you for taking him in. The realtor mentioned there had been some issues after Uncle Gerald passed. Wouldn't leave the porch," Harlan confirmed. "Storm forced the issue." Jennifer's expression clouded slightly. "I feel terrible about that. I should have come sooner, but the semester was ending, and then there were the holidays and the weather." She trailed off, the inadequacy of these explanations evident in her voice. "Anyway, I'm here now. I've made arrangements to take Bracken back to Boston with me. I have a small house with a garden, plenty of space for him." The statement hung in the air, reasonable and final. Of course, Gerald's niece would want to take her uncle's beloved pet. Of course, this was the proper resolution to what had always been described as a temporary situation. So why did Harlan feel as if the floor had suddenly shifted beneath his feet? "I see," he managed, his voice neutral despite the unexpected turbulence of his emotions. "When were you thinking of taking him?" "Today, if possible," Jennifer replied. "I've brought a carrier, and I've already spoken with the local veterinarian, Dr. Lawson, about his records. She mentioned he's been receiving excellent care here, which I appreciate more than I can say." From the kitchen doorway came a soft sound. Bracken had emerged, perhaps drawn by the familiar cadence of human conversation that had become part of his new routine. He stood with tail slightly raised, ears forward, assessing the stranger in his territory. "There you are," Jennifer said softly, kneeling to extend her hand toward the cat. "Remember me, Bracken? I used to visit Uncle Gerald for Christmas. You would sit on my lap while we watched those old movies he loved." Bracken remained in the doorway, neither approaching nor retreating, his amber eyes fixed on Jennifer with an intensity that suggested he was processing this new development, perhaps searching for something familiar in her voice or scent. "He's still cautious," Harlan explained, feeling oddly defensive on Bracken's behalf. "Been through a lot. Takes time to adjust to changes." Jennifer straightened, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "Of course, I understand that. Perhaps if I sit quietly for a while, let him get reacquainted." Harlan nodded, finding himself suddenly reluctant to expedite this process. Despite knowing it was the right outcome, the logical conclusion to what had always been presented as temporary care. "Coffee?" he offered, falling back on the basic hospitality Edith had insisted upon whenever anyone crossed their threshold. "That would be lovely, thank you." While Harlan busied himself in the kitchen, Jennifer settled on the sofa, removing her coat, now that a longer stay seemed likely. She spoke softly to Bracken, who had retreated slightly but remained visible, watching her from the relative safety of the hallway. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner," she told the cat, her voice carrying to where Harlan stood measuring coffee grounds. "Uncle Gerald would be so disappointed in me. He loved you so much, you know. Always talked about you in our phone calls. What mischief you'd gotten into, how you kept him company through the long winters." There was genuine emotion in her voice, grief for her uncle, regret for her absence, a sincere desire to fulfill what she clearly saw as a family obligation. Harlan found he couldn't fault her motivations, even as a part of him rebelled against the impending disruption to the careful balance he and Bracken had established. When Maeve arrived for her scheduled visit an hour later, she found an unexpected tableau. Jennifer McAllister seated on the sofa, with a tentative Bracken sniffing her extended fingers, while Harlan stood by the window, his expression unreadable as he gazed out at the McAllister house across the street. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had company," Maeve apologized, taking in the scene with surprised eyes. "No need for apology," Harlan replied, turning from the window. "Ms. McAllister, this is Maeve Donovan from the animal shelter. Been helping with Bracken's care. Maeve, this is Gerald's niece. She's come to take Bracken to Boston." The introduction, delivered in Harlan's characteristically straightforward manner, nonetheless conveyed volumes in its brevity and tone. Maeve's eyes widened slightly as she processed this development. "Oh, I see. It's nice to meet you, Ms. McAllister. Jennifer, please. And likewise, Dr. Lawson mentioned you've been instrumental in Bracken's recovery. I can't thank you enough for looking after him." "It's been a community effort," Maeve replied diplomatically, setting down her bag. "Bracken has quite a fan club in Alder Creek now." The conversation that followed had the quality of a carefully choreographed dance. Polite, considerate, focused on Bracken's needs and well-being, yet with undercurrents that remained largely unacknowledged. Jennifer explained her plans for Bracken's care in Boston, her flexible work schedule at the university, the garden where he could safely explore. Maeve offered suggestions for easing the transition, recommended a veterinarian in Boston who specialized in cats with anxiety issues, provided information about Bracken's current routines and preferences. Harlan said little, moving between kitchen and living room, refilling coffee cups, occasionally glancing at Bracken, who had maintained his cautious distance from Jennifer despite her gentle overtures. "He's still very wary," Jennifer observed after another unsuccessful attempt to coax Bracken closer. "I'm wondering if taking him today might be too abrupt. Perhaps I should come back tomorrow. Give him time to get used to me?" The suggestion, reasonable and considerate, sparked an immediate if silent response in both Harlan and Maeve, a complex mixture of relief at the reprieve and acknowledgement that it merely postponed the inevitable. "Might be wise," Harlan agreed, his tone neutral despite the sudden easing of tension in his shoulders. "Transitions are hard on him. Best to take it slow." "I could come back in the morning," Jennifer suggested. "Spend some time with him, then take him back to Boston in the afternoon. I've booked a room at the inn just outside town." Plans were made, arrangements confirmed. Jennifer would return at 9 the next morning. Maeve offered to be present to help with the transition. Harlan agreed to prepare Bracken's belongings, the toys, blankets and other items that had accumulated during his stay. After Jennifer left, a heavy silence settled over the house. Bracken emerged fully from his wary semi-hiding, returning to his window seat as if nothing had changed, unaware that his world was about to shift yet again. "Well," Maeve said finally, "I suppose this is what we've been working toward all along. Bracken finding a permanent home." Harlan grunted non-committally, busying himself with gathering the coffee cups. "It's the right outcome," Maeve continued, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Harlan. "Jennifer is family. She knew Bracken before, has a connection to Gerald, and she seems very committed to giving him a good home." "Makes sense," Harlan agreed, his back to Maeve as he rinsed cups in the sink. "Always said this was temporary." The words were right, the sentiment appropriate, yet they rang hollow in the suddenly quiet house. Maeve watched as Bracken stretched on his window seat, unaware of the decisions being made about his future. Harlan's shoulders were tense beneath his flannel shirt, his movements more abrupt than usual as he washed the dishes. "I should go," Maeve said finally. "Let you prepare for tomorrow. I'll be back around 8:30 to help with everything." Harlan nodded without turning. "Appreciate that." At the door, Maeve hesitated. "Harlan, is this?" She couldn't find the right words to frame the question hovering between them, about attachment and loss, about the unexpected connections that form when we least expect them, about the pain of disruption even when the outcome is objectively right. "It's fine," Harlan said firmly, answering the unasked question. Always knew he'd move on eventually, better with family. Maeve nodded, recognizing the wall that had gone up, not in anger or rejection but in self-protection. A wall she suspected Harlan had maintained since Edith's passing, perhaps even earlier, through all the separations and returns of his naval career. "I'll see you in the morning." she said gently, and left him standing in the doorway, watching her departure with the same stoic expression he'd worn through all the changes of the past weeks. Inside, as darkness fell earlier than seemed fair, Harlan moved through his evening routine with mechanical precision. He prepared a simple dinner, soup heated on the stove, bread from Maggie's bakery, a glass of the red wine he permitted himself on occasion. He ate at the kitchen table, Bracken watching from his customary spot nearby, occasionally accepting a small morsel offered on an extended finger. "Going to Boston tomorrow," Harlan told the cat as he cleared his dishes. "Big city. Lots of noise. Garden, though. That'll be good for you." Bracken blinked slowly, his amber eyes reflecting the kitchen light. "Gerald's niece seems decent. Professor, smart. Probably has one of those fancy coffee machines that make espresso." Harlan continued his one-sided conversation as he wiped down the counters, put away the leftover soup, straightened the dish towel on its hook. "Better than here. More interesting." The cat tilted his head slightly as if considering this assessment. Later, settled in his recliner with his book, Harlan found himself unable to focus on the naval battle being described in detailed prose. His eyes kept drifting to Bracken, who had taken up his usual position on the sofa, curled into a neat circle of tabby fur. The house felt different somehow, not empty yet but already anticipating emptiness, like a room where furniture has been rearranged, leaving marks on the carpet where familiar pieces once stood. Harlan had lived alone for 5 years since Edith's passing. He had adjusted to solitude, had even embraced it in his way, finding comfort in routines uninterrupted, in silence undisturbed. Yet somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, that carefully constructed solitude had been breached, not just by Bracken's presence, but by Maeve's regular visits, by Emma's curious questions when she accompanied her father to drop off cat supplies from the hardware store, by Pastor William stopping by just to check in, by the gradual reintegration into the community that had begun with the storm and continued, almost without Harlan noticing, through small, daily interactions. And now, with Jennifer McAllister's arrival, the wheel had turned again. Bracken would go where he belonged, with Gerald's family, to a new home in Boston. Harlan's house would return to its previous state. The temporary disruption would end, routines would re-establish themselves, and life would continue as it had before. This was the natural order of things, the logical conclusion to what had always been described as a temporary arrangement. So why did it feel like loss all over again? As if sensing Harlan's troubled thoughts, Bracken stirred on the sofa. He stretched, front paws extending, back arching in that peculiarly feline gesture of contentment, then jumped lightly to the floor. With deliberate steps he approached Harlan's chair and after a moment's consideration, leapt onto the arm. Harlan remained perfectly still, book forgotten in his lap, as Bracken settled onto the arm of the recliner, close enough that Harlan could feel the warmth of him, could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing that was neither quite a purr nor simply respiration, but something in between. "Made yourself at home, haven't you?" Harlan murmured, carefully raising one hand to stroke Bracken's back with a single finger. The cat accepted this tentative caress, neither leaning into it nor pulling away, simply allowing the contact as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They sat like that for what might have been minutes or hours, man and cat, connected by touch and proximity, sharing space and silence as the January night deepened outside and the old house creaked and settled around them. Eventually, inevitably, morning came. Harlan rose early, as was his habit, and found Bracken already at the kitchen door, awaiting his customary morning routine: fresh water, breakfast, a brief exploration of the back porch, while Harlan had his first cup of coffee. Everything proceeded as normal, as if this weren't the last time they would share this particular routine in this particular place. Harlan moved through the familiar motions with deliberate care, noting details he had previously taken for granted, the way Bracken's whiskers twitched as he ate, the particular angle of his tail as he surveyed the backyard from the porch steps, the soft thump of his return through the cat door Harlan had installed in December. At precisely 8:30, Maeve arrived as promised, her expression suggesting she had slept as poorly as Harlan had. She carried a small basket filled with Bracken's favorite treats, a new toy and a soft blanket. "I thought he might like these for the journey," she explained, setting the basket on the kitchen table. "Familiar smells and textures can help with transitions." Harlan nodded, grateful for her practical approach to a situation that felt increasingly emotional, despite his best efforts to maintain detachment. They worked together to prepare for Jennifer's arrival, gathering Bracken's belongings, discussing the best way to introduce him to the carrier, with minimal trauma this time, reviewing his medication schedule and dietary preferences for Jennifer's reference. At 5 minutes to 9, a knock at the door announced Jennifer's arrival. She entered looking refreshed and optimistic, carrying the promised carrier and a folder of veterinary records Dr. Lawson had provided. "Good morning," she greeted them both warmly. "How is our boy today?" "Fine," Harlan replied, gesturing toward the living room where Bracken had retreated to his window seat, watching the proceedings with wary attention. "Had breakfast? Been on the porch already?" The next hour unfolded in a series of careful steps, Jennifer sitting near Bracken, speaking softly, offering treats from her hand, which he cautiously accepted after initial hesitation. Maeve provided a running commentary on his body language, interpreting subtle shifts in ear position or tail movement as indicators of his comfort level. Harlan moved between rooms, gathering last-minute items, checking and rechecking that nothing had been forgotten. Finally, the moment could be postponed no longer. The carrier sat open on the living room floor, lined with a blanket that smelled of Harlan's house. Bracken's belongings were packed in a small duffel bag. Jennifer's car was warmed up outside, ready for the journey to Boston. "I think it's time," Jennifer said gently, looking to Maeve for confirmation. Maeve nodded, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. "Yes, I think we've prepared as much as we can. Harlan, would you like to—" She gestured toward Bracken, suggesting that Harlan be the one to make the final transfer, a recognition of the bond that had formed, however unexpectedly, between the reclusive widower and the grieving cat. Harlan hesitated, then nodded stiffly. He approached the window seat where Bracken sat watching them all with intense focus. "Time to go," he told the cat simply, extending his hands. To everyone's surprise, Bracken didn't resist. He allowed Harlan to lift him, body tense but not struggling, as if he understood on some level that resistance was futile, that change was coming whether he wished it or not. Harlan held him for a moment, feeling the rapid heartbeat against his own chest, the warmth of the small body that had somehow worked its way into his carefully ordered existence. Then, with gentle firmness, he began to lower Bracken toward the waiting carrier. It was at this precise moment, when the outcome seemed inevitable, when the transfer from temporary to permanent home was literally in motion, that something shifted in the carefully choreographed proceedings. Bracken, who had been compliant until now, suddenly stiffened, his claws extended not in aggression but in desperate grip, catching in the fabric of Harlan's flannel shirt. His amber eyes, wide and intense, fixed on Harlan's face with an expression that needed no interpretation. Fear, yes, but something more complex beneath it, a plea that transcended species. Harlan froze, Bracken still in his arms, suspended above the carrier that represented yet another change, another loss, another adjustment to a world that had already shifted too many times. "He's frightened," Maeve observed softly. "Maybe we need to try a different approach." Jennifer, watching from a few steps away, frowned in concern. "I don't want to traumatize him. Perhaps if I leave the carrier and come back later, give him more time to adjust to the idea." But Harlan wasn't listening to either of them. Something had clicked into place in his mind, a recognition, a memory, a connection between past and present that suddenly illuminated the situation in a new light. He straightened, still holding Bracken against his chest, and rather than forcing the issue, he simply stood there, allowing the cat to maintain his desperate grip on the flannel shirt. "When Edith's mother moved in with us," Harlan said, his voice quiet but clear. "She was 87, had to leave the house she'd lived in for 60 years, fought us every step of the way, packed, unpacked, hid her medications, claimed she'd changed her mind. Day of the move, she sat in her favorite chair and wouldn't budge." Maeve and Jennifer exchanged puzzled glances, uncertain where this sudden narrative was heading. Edith tried everything, reasoning, pleading, even called the doctor to see if they could prescribe something to calm her down. Nothing worked. Harlan stroked Bracken's back with careful fingers, feeling the tension in the small body. "Finally, I just sat down across from her and said, 'You're scared. That's natural. But you're not alone. We're right here with you.'" He looked down at Bracken, whose grip had relaxed slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on Harlan's face. "She got up then, came with us without another word of protest, lived with us for 4 more years, happy as could be once she got past that fear." A silence fell over the room as the implications of Harlan's story sank in. Jennifer was the first to speak. "Are you suggesting that Bracken is afraid of leaving? That he's formed an attachment here?" Harlan shrugged, a gesture that might have appeared dismissive if not for the careful way he continued to hold Bracken, mindful of the cat's anxiety. Just saying fear looks the same across species sometimes. Change is hard even when it's for the best. Maeve stepped closer, studying Bracken's body language with professional attention. He's definitely bonded with you, Harlan. That's clear from how he's responding now. But Jennifer is family, Gerald's family. She has a right. I know that, Harlan interrupted more sharply than he'd intended. He took a breath, modulating his tone, just thinking, maybe there's another way to look at this. Jennifer moved to the sofa and sat down, her expression thoughtful. Uncle Gerald would want what's best for Bracken. That's why I came, because I felt responsible, because I thought taking him to Boston was the right thing to do. She looked at the cat, still clinging to Harlan, and then at Harlan himself, standing awkwardly in the middle of the living room, accepting those claws in his shirt without complaint. But maybe I was thinking more about my obligation than about what Bracken actually needs. He needs stability, Maeve offered gently. After everything that's happened, losing Gerald, the time on the porch, the storm, he needs to feel secure again. And he feels secure here, Jennifer concluded, a small smile forming. With you, Mr. Winters. Harlan, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken, shifted slightly. Temporary arrangement, that's what we agreed. Maybe it doesn't have to be, Jennifer suggested. Maybe this is where he belongs now. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Harlan looked down at Bracken, who had relaxed his grip slightly but still maintained firm contact with the flannel shirt, as if afraid that any release might result in immediate transfer to the waiting carrier. I don't know the first thing about keeping a cat, Harlan protested, though the words lacked conviction. Maeve laughed softly. Harlan, you've been keeping a cat for weeks now, and doing a fine job of it, according to Dr. Lawson. It's different, Harlan insisted. Temporary is different from permanent. The word hung in the air between them. Permanent. A commitment, a responsibility, a change to the careful isolation Harlan had maintained since Edith's passing. A disruption to routines established over years, not just the weeks of Bracken's stay. Jennifer stood, decision evident in her posture. I think Bracken has made his choice clear. And having met you, Mr. Winters, having seen how he responds to you, I believe Uncle Gerald would approve. She smiled, a gesture tinged with both sadness and acceptance. He valued loyalty above all else, in people and in animals. So that's it? Harlan asked, still holding Bracken against his chest. You're just leaving him here? If you're willing, Jennifer confirmed. Are you? The directness of the question caught Harlan off guard. Was he willing? The automatic response, the one that aligned with his carefully constructed self-image as a solitary man who needed nothing and no one, would be no. But the truth, as evidenced by the weeks since the storm, by the changed rhythms of his days, by the comfort he found in Bracken's quiet presence, was more complicated. Bracken, perhaps sensing the importance of the moment, shifted in Harlan's arms. He released his grip on the flannel shirt and instead placed one paw against Harlan's chest just over his heart. The gesture, so deliberate it seemed almost human, carried a weight of meaning that none of the humans in the room could miss. Harlan cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion rising unbidden. Guess we've gotten used to each other, he admitted gruffly. Wouldn't be right to disrupt things now that he's settled. Jennifer's smile widened, genuine relief evident in her expression. I think that's the right decision, for both of you. She reached for her purse, extracting a business card. Here's my contact information. I'd like to visit occasionally if that's all right, and perhaps you could send updates. Photos. The idea of sending cat photos, of engaging in such a domestic, sentimental practice, would have seemed absurd to Harlan a month ago. Yet now, with Bracken warm and alive in his arms, with the crisis of separation averted by this unexpected solution, it seemed like a reasonable concession. Could do that, he agreed. Maeve's better with the camera phone things, but we could work something out. Maeve, watching this exchange with barely contained emotion, nodded enthusiastically. I'd be happy to help with that. And continued visits, of course, to check on Bracken's progress. The arrangements were quickly finalized. Jennifer would leave the carrier, just in case you need it for vet visits, and take with her Gerald's old photo albums and some personal items from the house across the street, which would soon be sold to new owners. She would return to Boston with the knowledge that her uncle's beloved cat was where he needed to be, with someone who, against all expectations, had become his new person. As Jennifer prepared to leave, she approached Harlan once more, extending her hand. Thank you, Mr. Winters, for everything you've done for Bracken and for being willing to continue. Harlan, still holding Bracken, managed an awkward handshake, just doing what needed doing. After Jennifer departed, a curious quiet settled over the house. Not the tense silence of anticipation that had preceded her visit, but something more peaceful, a sense of resolution or perhaps new beginning. Maeve watched as Harlan finally set Bracken down, the cat immediately moving to his window seat, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if the drama of the morning had been merely a brief interruption to his regular schedule. "So," Maeve said finally, breaking the silence, "it looks like you're a cat owner now, officially." Harlan grunted, moving to the kitchen where he busied himself making a fresh pot of coffee. "Suppose so." Maeve followed, leaning against the doorframe as he measured grounds with his usual precision. "How do you feel about that?" The question was direct, perhaps more direct than their established patterns of interaction typically allowed. But the morning's events had shifted something between them as well, had acknowledged an emotional dimension to their connection that went beyond the practical collaboration of recent weeks. Harlan paused in his coffee preparation, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Different," he admitted finally. "Not what I expected when he showed up at the back door during the storm, but not unwelcome." Coming from Harlan, this qualified as an effusive declaration. Maeve smiled, understanding the depth beneath the sparse words. "I'm glad," she said simply. "For both of you." Later that evening, after Maeve had gone and the house had settled into its nighttime rhythms, Harlan sat in his recliner with his book. Bracken, as had become his custom, occupied the sofa nearby, curled into a neat circle of tabby fur. The scene was identical to countless evenings over the past weeks, yet fundamentally altered by the events of the day, by decisions made and unmade, by paths chosen and unchosen. Something had shifted, not just in Harlan's relationship with Bracken, but in his understanding of himself. The carefully maintained isolation of the past 5 years had been breached, not by force, but by necessity, by circumstance, by the gradual accumulation of small connections, a cat seeking shelter, a woman bringing food, a child asking questions, a community watching and wondering, and eventually accepting. "Permanent," Harlan said aloud, testing the word in the quiet room. Bracken's ear twitched at the sound, but he didn't raise his head from his paws. "Means you're staying," Harlan continued, more to himself than to the cat. "Means things don't go back to how they were before." This time, Bracken did look up, amber eyes reflecting the lamplight as he regarded Harlan with what might have been curiosity or simply feline attention to movement and sound. "Need a proper name for this arrangement," Harlan mused. "Foster doesn't fit anymore. Owner sounds wrong too, companion maybe." Bracken blinked slowly, then stood, stretching with deliberate leisure before jumping lightly to the floor. With unhurried steps, he approached Harlan's chair and, without hesitation this time, leapt onto the arm. He settled there, tail curled neatly around his paws, close enough that Harlan could feel the warmth of him, the subtle vibration that might have been the beginnings of a purr. Almost without conscious thought, Harlan raised his hand and stroked the cat's back with gentle fingers. "You're safe," he said quietly, the words that had come to him earlier, the words that had unlocked a memory and changed the course of the day. "You're safe here." Bracken leaned almost imperceptibly into the touch, the vibration deepening into a definite purr, soft, tentative, but unmistakable. Something unlocked in Harlan's chest at the sound, a tightness he hadn't fully acknowledged until it began to ease, a constriction around his heart that had been present for so long it had become part of his normal state of being. "We'll be all right," he told Bracken, continuing the gentle stroking. "Both of us." Outside, snow began to fall again, not the violent blizzard that had brought them together, but a gentle descent of flakes that muffled sounds and softened edges. Inside, man and cat remained in their quiet communion, connected by touch and proximity, and the simple truth contained in those 3 words, "You're safe here." It wasn't a dramatic transformation, wasn't a complete reversal of loss or absence. Edith was still gone. Gerald was still gone. The past remained unchanged, but something new had begun. Tentative, unexpected, yet undeniably real. In homes across Alder Creek, lights glowed against the early winter darkness. In the parsonage beside the white church, Pastor Williams prepared Sunday's sermon, drawing inspiration from the unexpected community that had formed around a grieving cat. At the hardware store, Drew Thorne helped Emma select a new toy for Mr. Winter's cat, a small peace offering from the family that had once sought Bracken's removal. At the animal shelter, Dr. Lawson updated Bracken's records, changing his status from fostered to adopted. making official what the morning's events had revealed. And in Harlan's house, in the circle of lamplight that held back the winter dark, healing continued its slow, steady work, not erasing what had been lost, but creating space for what might yet be found. February arrived with a bitter cold snap that froze pipes across Alder Creek and turned Main Street into a treacherous expanse of ice. Despite Walter Jenkins' best efforts with salt and sand, the town hunkered down, retreating into the familiar rhythms of deep winter. Early suppers, extra blankets, cars left running during brief errands to prevent batteries from surrendering to the cold. In Harlan's house, new patterns had established themselves. Bracken now slept on the bed, curled at Harlan's feet like a living hot water bottle. Mornings began with shared rituals. Harlan's coffee, Bracken's breakfast, a brief survey of the backyard from the warmth of the kitchen, while the radio provided a background of news and weather reports. Evenings ended with Bracken on the arm of the recliner, sometimes venturing onto Harlan's lap for brief periods before returning to his preferred perch. Maeve's visits continued, though their nature had subtly shifted from professional oversight to something more like friendship. She brought books she thought Harlan might enjoy, swapped stories of difficult animal rescues for his tales of naval adventures, occasionally stayed for dinner, simple meals that Harlan prepared with increasing confidence, drawing on skills long dormant since Edith's passing. "I should come to the shelter sometime," Maeve suggested during one such evening as they cleared plates from the table. "Bracken might enjoy socializing with other cats, and we could always use an extra pair of hands for the heavy lifting." Harlan, rinsing dishes with his usual methodical care, considered the invitation. A month ago, he might have dismissed it outright. Venturing to the shelter meant more interaction, more conversation, more expectations beyond his carefully limited social engagement. But something had changed, not just in his circumstances, but in his willingness to consider new possibilities. "Could do that," he agreed, surprising himself as much as Maeve. "Next week maybe, when this cold snap breaks." The smile that lit Maeve's face suggested his acceptance meant more than the simple agreement it appeared to be, a recognition of the gradual opening that had occurred since Bracken's arrival, a willingness to extend connections beyond the boundaries of his own home. The "for sale" sign across the street had acquired a sold banner in January, and moving trucks arrived in the second week of February. Harlan watched from his window as strangers transferred furniture and boxes into Gerald's house, a young couple with a preschool-aged daughter, bringing new life to spaces that had stood empty for months. Bracken watched too, his tail twitching occasionally, though whether from interest or anxiety was difficult to determine. "Different people now," Harlan told him, stroking the cat's back with absent-minded fingers. "Not the same, but not bad either. Change happens." The simple philosophy, delivered to feline ears, nonetheless represented a significant shift in Harlan's own thinking, an acceptance that change, while often unwelcome, was not necessarily catastrophic. It was a lesson Bracken had taught him, though neither could have articulated the exchange. On Valentine's Day, Emma Thorne appeared at Harlan's door, clutching a small paper bag decorated with heart stickers. "Dad said I could bring this over," she announced when Harlan answered her knock. "It's for Bracken and for you too, I guess." Inside the bag was a catnip mouse wearing a tiny red bow tie and a heart-shaped cookie wrapped in cellophane. The gift, simple and childish, caught Harlan off guard. He hadn't received a Valentine since Edith's passing, had in fact deliberately ignored the holiday as a painful reminder of her absence. "Thank you," he said, accepting the bag with more solemnity than such a whimsical offering might typically warrant. "That's very thoughtful." Emma beamed, clearly pleased by his response. "Is Bracken here? Can I see him?" A month ago, Harlan might have made an excuse. The cat was sleeping or hiding or otherwise unavailable for visitors. But today he simply stepped back, allowing Emma entry into his home. "He's in the living room. Remember, no sudden movements. Let him come to you if he wants." Emma nodded seriously, following Harlan's instructions with the careful attention of a child determined to do things right. She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands folded in her lap, watching as Bracken observed her from his window seat. "He looks happy," she pronounced after a moment of mutual assessment. "Dad says you're keeping him for good now. Is that true?" "That's right," Harlan confirmed, setting the cookie on a small plate. "Would you like some milk with this?" Made sense for him to stay where he'd settled. Emma accepted the milk and cookie with a polite thank you that spoke of careful parental coaching. "I told Dad that Bracken chose you, like in the stories where animals know who their person is supposed to be." The simplicity of this explanation, The certainty with which Emma presented it struck Harlan as profound in its way. Perhaps it was as straightforward as that. Perhaps all the adult complications, Gerald's niece, the shelter's protocols, the town's divided opinions, had merely obscured what Emma saw clearly. Bracken had chosen, and in accepting that choice, Harlan had chosen too. Might be something to that, he acknowledged, watching as Bracken cautiously descended from his perch and approached Emma with careful steps. The visit lasted only 15 minutes. Emma had promised her father she wouldn't stay long, but it represented another brick removed from the wall Harlan had built around his life after Edith's death. A child with Valentine cookies, a cat making tentative connections, a community that had shifted from viewing him as the town recluse to seeing him as Bracken's chosen person. Small changes that accumulated into something more significant than their individual impacts might suggest. As February gave way to March, signs of spring began to appear, despite occasional snowstorms that reminded everyone that winter wasn't quite finished with New England. Crocuses pushed through partially frozen ground, bird calls changed from winter's sparse communications to the more elaborate songs of mating season, and the quality of light shifted, carrying hints of warmth even on cold days. Harlan kept his promise to visit the shelter, initially for a single afternoon of helping move heavy donations of pet food and building new cat climbing structures. The visit extended to a regular Tuesday commitment, then expanded to include Saturday mornings as well. He found unexpected satisfaction in the physical work, in using skills from his naval days and his woodworking hobby to improve the shelter's facilities. "You've got quite a knack for this, Doctor," Lawson commented one Saturday, as she admired the new feeding station Harlan had designed, a clever arrangement that allowed multiple cats to eat without crowding each other. "We've needed someone with your skills for ages." Harlan shrugged off the compliment, uncomfortable as always with direct praise, but there was a quiet pride in the set of his shoulders as he made final adjustments to the structure. Bracken sometimes accompanied him on these visits, riding in the carrier that had once represented unwelcome change, but now simply meant a trip to an interesting place with new scents and occasional feline companionship. He maintained his cautious nature, but showed increasing comfort with the shelter environment, even allowing some of the more sociable cats to approach him under Maeve's watchful supervision. "He's a different cat than he was in December, Doctor," Lawson observed during one such interaction. "Still reserved, still careful, but secure in a way he wasn't before. You've done wonders with him, Harlan." Again, Harlan deflected the praise. "Just gave him time and space. He did the rest himself." But the truth, as both he and Dr. Lawson knew, was more complex. The healing had been mutual, a gradual process of trust building that had changed both cat and man. Bracken had found security after loss. Harlan had found connection after isolation. Neither was fixed or cured. Grief doesn't work that way. But both had found a way forward that honored what had been lost while creating space for what might yet be found. The McAllister house, now occupied by the Rawlings family, gradually transformed with the arrival of spring. The father, Michael, planted new shrubs along the front walk. The mother, Teresa, hung cheerful curtains in windows that had been bare through the winter. Their daughter, Lily, rode a tricycle with colorful streamers on the same porch where Bracken had maintained his lonely vigil months before. Harlan watched these changes from across the street, not with resentment at the erasure of Gerald's presence, but with a complicated mixture of emotions that included both melancholy and a cautious appreciation for the renewal taking place. Life continued. Empty spaces filled. New stories began where old ones had ended. One Saturday in late March, as Harlan was raking the winter debris from his front yard, Michael Rawlings approached from across the street, his daughter trailing behind him. "Mr. Winters?" Michael called. "Got a minute?" Harlan straightened, leaning on his rake. "Something I can help with?" Michael smiled, extending his hand. "Just wanted to introduce ourselves properly. Michael Rawlings. This is Lily. My wife Teresa is inside unpacking still. We've been meaning to come over since we moved in, but it's been chaos getting settled." Harlan shook the offered hand, nodding to the little girl who regarded him with solemn curiosity. "Harlan Winters, welcome to Alder Creek." "Thanks, actually we had a question. We found some old garden tools in the shed that we don't need. Looks like Mr. McAllister was quite the gardener. We thought you might be able to use them or know someone who could." The mention of Gerald's gardening brought a brief but vivid memory. Gerald, in his wide-brimmed hat, kneeling among tomato plants, Bracken supervising from the shade of a nearby bush. Saturday mornings often found them both in the garden, Gerald working, Bracken patrolling the perimeter for insects or small rodents that might threaten his domain. "Sure," Harlan replied, bringing himself back to the present. "Could take a look. Might be able to use them myself." This simple exchange, neighbors discussing garden tools, a child watching shyly from behind her father's leg, represented yet another opening, another connection forming, where isolation had once been the default state. As Harlan followed Michael across the street to examine the tools, he glanced back at his own house. Through the front window, he could see Bracken in his favorite spot, watching the proceedings with feline intensity. The cat's vigilance had taken on a different quality over the months. Less desperate guarding against further loss, more curious observation of a world that, while still approached with caution, no longer represented only threat. The garden tools proved to be of excellent quality. Gerald had invested in the best, as he did with most things. Harlan recognized several pieces he'd admired when his neighbor had shown them off years ago. Taking them felt like accepting a legacy of sorts, a continuation rather than an ending. "These are fine tools," he told Michael. "Would be glad to put them to use." "Great. Teresa will be thrilled. She was worried they'd just end up in a landfill somewhere." Michael glanced at the overgrown garden beds that had once been Gerald's pride. "We're not much for gardening ourselves. Trying to learn, but it's all new to us. If you have any tips about what grows well here, we'd appreciate the advice." The request was casual, neighborly, without expectation or demand, just one resident seeking knowledge from another with more experience. Yet it carried an implicit invitation to ongoing connection, to relationship beyond a single transaction. "Could tell you a few things," Harlan found himself offering. "Soil here favors certain plants. Gerald had success with tomatoes, zucchini, raspberries along the back fence." Michael's face lit up with genuine appreciation. "That would be fantastic. Teresa's parents are coming to visit next month, and her dad's a big gardening enthusiast. Would love to have something started by then." Plans were made for Harlan to return the following weekend with seed catalogs and basic advice. As he gathered the tools to take back to his house, Lily, who had been silent throughout the adult conversation, suddenly pointed toward Harlan's window. "Kitty!" she exclaimed, her small face brightening at the sight of Bracken watching from across the street. "That's Bracken," Harlan explained, finding himself unexpectedly at ease with the child's enthusiasm. "He lives with me now, but he used to live here with Mr. McAllister." "Can I see him sometime?" Lily asked, looking up at Harlan with the direct gaze of early childhood. "I like kitties." Before Harlan could formulate a response, Michael intervened gently. "Bracken might not be used to little girls, sweetheart. We need to respect his space." "Actually," Harlan heard himself saying, "he's gotten better with visitors. Cautious, but not fearful anymore. If you'd like to bring Lily over sometime, she could meet him. Slowly, with supervision." The offer, made almost without conscious thought, represented how far things had shifted. Harlan Winters, who once limited his social interactions to the bare minimum required for survival in a small town, was inviting neighbors, new neighbors with a small child, into his home to meet his cat. Michael's surprise was evident, though he covered it quickly with a warm smile. "That's very kind of you." "Lily would love that, wouldn't you, Pumpkin?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically, already captivated by the prospect of meeting the tabby cat in the window. Later, as Harlan arranged Gerald's tools in his own shed with careful precision, he reflected on the morning's unexpected developments. A month ago, even a few weeks ago, he would have kept the conversation brief, accepted the tools with minimal interaction, and retreated back to his own property as quickly as politeness allowed. The idea of offering gardening advice or inviting a child to meet Bracken would have been unthinkable. What had changed? The obvious answer was Bracken himself. The cat's presence had created openings for connection that might not otherwise have occurred. But Harlan knew it went deeper than that. Something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of loss and what came after. Not a diminishment of what had been, but an expansion that allowed new experiences alongside cherished memories. That evening, as had become their custom, Harlan and Bracken shared the quiet of the living room, Harlan in his recliner with a book, Bracken on the sofa nearby. The cat seemed particularly content, stretched out full length in a patch of late March sunlight that warmed the cushions. "Met the new neighbors today," Harlan told him, a habit of one-sided conversation that had developed naturally over the months. "Seem decent. Little girl wants to meet you." Bracken's ear twitched in acknowledgement, though his eyes remained closed in feline contentment. "Been thinking about the garden this year," Harlan continued. setting his book aside. "Gerald's tools will help. Might plant tomatoes again. You used to watch him garden, I remember." At the mention of Gerald, Bracken opened his eyes, regarding Harlan with that unblinking amber gaze that sometimes seemed to hold wisdom beyond human understanding. "Different now," Harlan acknowledged softly, "but not all different is bad." The cat blinked slowly, a gesture that feline behaviorists interpret as affection or trust. Then, with deliberate movements, he rose, stretched, and jumped lightly to the floor. Instead of returning to his sun-warmed spot, he approached Harlan's chair and, with a single graceful leap, settled onto his lap. This was still a relatively rare occurrence. Bracken usually preferred the arm of the chair to direct contact. Harlan remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe lest he disturb this moment of chosen proximity. After a moment, he cautiously raised his hand and stroked Bracken's back with gentle fingers. The purr that rumbled in response was no longer the tentative vibration of early days, but a full-throated expression of contentment. Bracken settled more firmly onto Harlan's lap, eyes closing again as he surrendered to the simple pleasure of touch and warmth and safety. "That's right," Harlan murmured, continuing the steady stroking. "You're safe here. We both are." Outside, the March wind rattled branches, still waiting for leaves, carrying hints of both winter's retreat and spring's approach. Inside, man and cat remained in their quiet communion, connected by choice rather than circumstance, by the slow, steady work of healing that had transformed them both. What would tomorrow bring? New neighbors to know, gardens to plan, a child's visit to prepare for, small ordinary events that would once have seemed overwhelming in their demand for engagement, but now represented possibilities rather than threats. The future, always uncertain, felt less daunting when faced not in isolation, but in connection, however modest those connections might be. As twilight deepened into night, Harlan continued his gentle stroking, feeling the weight of Bracken warm and trusting on his lap. The grief that had marked them both, Bracken for Gerald, Harlan for Edith, hadn't disappeared, would never disappear completely, but it had changed, had softened into something that could be carried alongside joy, alongside new bonds, alongside the simple pleasure of a March evening spent in shared comfort. "We'll be all right," Harlan told Bracken, words that had become something of a mantra between them, both of us. And in that moment, as stars appeared in the clearing sky and lights winked on in homes across Alder Creek, it felt like not just a hope, but a promise, one they were both, in their different ways, learning to believe. April arrived with its characteristic unpredictability, one day offering sunshine and birdsong, the next delivering sleet that coated branches in crystalline sheaths. Alder Creek emerged from winter's grip with cautious optimism, residents venturing out more frequently, lingering in conversations on street corners, making plans for gardens and home improvements and summer vacations. Harlan, once the town's most reliable recluse, found himself increasingly integrated into community life, though still on terms that honored his preference for quieter interactions. His regular volunteer work at the shelter had expanded to include mentoring a high school student interested in woodworking. His gardening advice to the Rawlings family had led to weekend sessions where he demonstrated basic techniques, with Lily as an enthusiastic, if not always helpful, assistant. Even Drew Thorne had become something of an unexpected ally, setting aside a special section in the hardware store for pet project supplies after noticing Harlan's frequent purchases for shelter improvements. Bracken, too, continued his gradual expansion into a wider world. He now greeted Maeve at the door when she visited, rather than watching warily from a distance. He tolerated Lily's supervised visits with remarkable patience, even allowing the careful strokes of small fingers across his back. He had developed a particular interest in the birds that visited Harlan's newly installed feeders, spending hours in chittering conversation with chickadees and finches through the living room window. One crisp Saturday morning in mid-April, Pastor Williams appeared at Harlan's door with an unusual request. "We're planning a special service," he explained after Harlan invited him in for coffee, "a celebration of new beginnings, timed with Easter, but broader in scope. I was hoping you might consider sharing Bracken's story as part of it." Harlan, pouring coffee into the mug that had become designated as the pastor's during his increasingly regular visits, frowned slightly. Not much of a public speaker, especially about personal matters. Pastor Williams nodded, accepting both the coffee and the reservation with equal grace. "I understand that. It wouldn't need to be elaborate, Just a few words about how Bracken came to stay with you, what you've learned from the experience. The congregation has followed this journey from afar, so to speak. It would mean a lot to hear directly from you. The request hung in the air between them, weighted with implications beyond the simple act of speaking at a church service. It represented a public acknowledgement of change, a stepping fully into the light after years of shadow. Need to think about it, Harlan said finally. Not a quick yes or no. Of course, Pastor Williams agreed easily. The service is next Sunday. You have time to consider. He sipped his coffee, then added with a gentle smile, "No pressure, Harlan. The invitation stands whether you accept it or not." After the pastor left, Harlan found himself unusually restless. He moved through his morning chores with mechanical efficiency, his mind circling the request and its implications. Bracken, sensing his distraction, stayed closer than usual, occasionally touching Harlan's ankle with a gentle paw, as if to ground him in the present moment. "Not sure about this one," Harlan told the cat as they sat on the back porch, enjoying a brief patch of sunshine. "Standing up in church talking about us feels exposed." Bracken blinked slowly, his amber eyes regarding Harlan with what might have been understanding or simply feline patience with human complexity. Later that afternoon, Maeve arrived for her usual Saturday visit, bringing news from the shelter and a small plant for Harlan's windowsill. "Catnip," she explained with a smile. Thought Bracken might enjoy watching it grow. As they sat in the kitchen, Bracken investigating the new plant with careful sniffs, Harlan mentioned Pastor Williams' request. "He wants me to speak, at church, about Bracken." Maeve's eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. "That's quite an honor. What do you think about it?" "Not sure," Harlan admitted, his discomfort evident. "Never been one for public speaking." "It wouldn't need to be long," Maeve suggested gently. "Just a few minutes, sharing what this experience has meant to you, to both of you." She nodded toward Bracken, who had settled beside the catnip plant with proprietary satisfaction. "Why does it matter?" Harlan asked, the question more genuine than defensive. "It's just a cat who needed a home." Maeve considered her response carefully. "I think it's because your story with Bracken resonates with people. It's about second chances, about finding connection when you least expect it. Everyone in town watched Bracken on that porch for weeks, refusing to leave despite everything. Then they watched how a storm brought you together, how you both gradually opened up to new possibilities. It's hopeful." Harlan absorbed this perspective in silence, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. The idea that his private experience might hold meaning for others hadn't occurred to him, or perhaps he hadn't allowed it to occur to him, protective as he'd always been of his personal boundaries. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Throughout the week that followed, Harlan found himself mentally composing and discarding potential versions of what he might say if he accepted Pastor Williams's invitation. Each attempt felt either too personal or too superficial, too emotional or too detached. How could he articulate something he himself was still coming to understand, the subtle, profound transformation that had occurred since Bracken entered his life? The answer came unexpectedly, as meaningful insights often do. Harlan was in his backyard, turning the soil in what would become a vegetable garden, with Bracken supervising from a sunny patch nearby. The physical work had always helped clarify his thinking, and as he rhythmically worked the earth, preparing it for new growth, something clicked into place. Sunday morning arrived clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline spring light that makes even ordinary scenes appear slightly magical. The white church at the center of Alder Creek gleamed against the blue sky, its doors open wide to welcome the congregation. Inside, flowers adorned every surface, daffodils and tulips, hyacinths and early roses, symbolizing the renewal the service was designed to celebrate. Harlan arrived early, by arrangement with Pastor Williams. He wore his navy blue suit reserved for funerals and rare formal occasions, freshly pressed and slightly uncomfortable. Bracken traveled in his carrier, unusually cooperative as if sensing the importance of the occasion. As the congregation gathered, Harlan sat in a small anteroom, Bracken now out of his carrier and settled on his lap, both of them waiting for their moment. Through the open door, Harlan could hear the familiar sounds of the service, hymns sung with enthusiasm if not always precision, Pastor Williams's warm voice leading prayers, the rustle of programs, and occasional cough from the assembled townspeople. "Almost time," he murmured to Bracken, who blinked up at him with calm eyes, seemingly untroubled by the unfamiliar environment. When Pastor Williams finally called them forward, Harlan carried Bracken to the front of the church, standing before his neighbors and friends with the cat cradled securely in his arms. The faces looking back at him represented the full spectrum of Alder Creek. Eleanor Bishop and Martha Lawson in their Sunday best, Emma Thorne with her parents, the Rawlings family with little Lily waving excitedly, Maeve in a spring dress he'd never seen before, Dr. Lawson, Walter Jenkins, and dozens of others who had watched this story unfold from various distances. Harlan cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the attention, but committed now to the task. "Not much for speeches," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "But Pastor Williams asked me to share something about Bracken here and what's happened since the storm in December." He glanced down at the cat in his arms, drawing strength from the familiar weight and warmth. "Most of you know the beginning. How Bracken wouldn't leave Gerald McAllister's porch after he passed, how he stayed through rain and cold, how the blizzard finally forced him to seek shelter. What you might not know is what happened after." With simple, direct language, Harlan described the gradual transformation, Bracken's slow journey from fear to trust, his own unexpected opening to new connections, the quiet moments of breakthrough that had accumulated into significant change. "There was a moment," he said, his voice softening slightly, "when Gerald's niece came to take Bracken to Boston. Made perfect sense. She was family, had a good home waiting, but when the time came, he wouldn't go. Clung to me like he'd decided where he belonged." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation. "That's when I realized something I'd been missing," Harlan continued. "Sometimes, what looks like stubbornness is really loyalty. What looks like fear is really caution. And what looks like being stuck is really just waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right understanding to move forward." He stroked Bracken's back gently, the cat now purring audibly in the quiet church. There were 3 words that changed everything. Simple words but true. "You're safe here." Once Bracken understood that, really understood it, he could start to live again, not just survive. Harlan looked up, meeting the eyes of his neighbors with a directness that would have been unthinkable months before. "I needed to hear those words too, though I didn't know it. After Edith passed, I thought being alone was safer. Thought connections just meant more loss waiting to happen. Bracken taught me otherwise." The silence in the church was complete, every person present absorbed in the unadorned honesty of Harlan's words. "So, that's our story," he concluded simply. "A stubborn cat, a reluctant man, and a storm that pushed us together when we both needed it most. Nothing miraculous about it, except maybe in the ordinary way that life continues, that healing happens, that connections form even when we think we're done with all that." As Harlan returned to his seat, Bracken still content in his arms, the congregation rose in spontaneous applause, not the polite acknowledgement of a well-delivered speech, but the genuine appreciation of a community witnessing the completion of a circle. Later, at the reception in the church hall, Harlan found himself surrounded by well-wishers, many sharing their own stories of healing after loss, of unexpected connections, of second chances that arrived disguised as disruptions. Bracken, now comfortably settled in a quiet corner, accepted gentle attention from a carefully supervised rotation of admirers, his amber eyes watching Harlan across the room as if to ensure his person remained within sight. "You did wonderfully," Maeve told Harlan, appearing at his side with 2 cups of punch. "I knew you would." Harlan accepted the punch with a nod of thanks. "Said what needed saying, that's all. Sometimes that's the most important thing," she replied with a smile, saying exactly what needs to be said when it needs to be heard. As spring deepened into summer, Alder Creek continued its seasonal transformations. The garden behind Harlan's house flourished under his renewed attention, producing vegetables he shared with neighbors and the community kitchen. The McAllister house, now fully the Rawlings home, bloomed with new plantings and the sounds of a child's laughter. The animal shelter, benefiting from Harlan's regular contributions of skill and time, expanded its facilities to include an outdoor cat enclosure he had designed and built with volunteer help. Bracken, once known as the cat who refused to leave, became instead Harlan's cat, a familiar presence on the front porch, occasionally accompanying Harlan on walks through town, even making supervised visits to the elementary school as part of a program teaching children about animal care and empathy. The story of the grieving cat and the reclusive widower became part of Alder Creek's collective narrative, not as gossip or curiosity, but as affirmation that healing rarely follows a straight line, that connection often arrives in unexpected forms, and that 3 simple words, "You're safe here," can sometimes open doors that neither lock nor time had managed to unlock. On a perfect June evening, as twilight softened the edges of the day, Harlan sat on his front porch with Bracken beside him on the swing Drew Thorne had helped him install as a neighborhood project. Across the street, Michael Rawlings waved as he checked his mailbox. Down the block, Emma rode her bicycle with streamers flying from the handlebars. From the direction of the town square came the distant sounds of the community band practicing for the 4th of July celebration. "Good evening," Harlan murmured, more to himself than to Bracken, though the cat's ear twitched in acknowledgement. The simple statement held worlds of meaning: appreciation for the present moment, acceptance of the journey that had brought them here, openness to whatever might come next. Not a complete healing, for grief never truly ends, but a transformation of it into something that could exist alongside joy, alongside connection, alongside new beginnings. Bracken stretched languorously, then settled closer to Harlan's side, his purr a soft vibration against the wooden swing. Above them, the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the sky. Before them stretched Main Street, the heart of Alder Creek, the community that had watched and worried and finally welcomed them both home. "We'll be all right," Harlan told Bracken, the words that had become their shared affirmation. And in that moment, as darkness gathered and porch lights winked on along the street, it wasn't just a hope or a promise, but a simple, profound truth, one they had earned together, step by cautious step, heartbeat by heartbeat, day by ordinary, extraordinary day.